Now hear evidence from Joshua Reddaway from the National Audit Office and Richard Lass from His Majesty's Revenue and Customs. We have until 2:30. Rebecca Smith.
Thank you, Chair. Hello. I think this question is for you, Joshua, if I may. The bill, as you no doubt know, would allow the PSFA to be established as a separate body from the Cabinet Office. Do you think that this is the right approach with the bill, and what benefits do you think this would bring?
Well, I guess I'm agnostic as to what's done, but the benefits, I guess, would be an opportunity for governance, an opportunity for accountability and clarity and transparency. I'm sure we would be absolutely delighted to audit the accounts for them and to help provide some of that transparency. Of course, currently they're incorporated within the Cabinet Office, so it's about clear line of sight. Against that, you've got to offset the fact that there's an administrative burden for producing things like sets of accounts and having governance and so on. I think the bigger question is around, and the one for this committee would be, does that better enable oversight of the powers that are in this bill?
By having a separate organisation?
By having a separate body.
And do you have an opinion on that? Or?
I don't have a major opinion on it. I would ask the question, are you comfortable with the oversight arrangements? One of the things I'd point out is that this will be as close to an anti-corruption unit as government has with search powers. Are you happy with that being constitutionally in the Cabinet Office or not? I'm also interested in what is the criteria. I note under the explanatory note in the impact assessment, they've set out that there will be an efficiency assessment for the powers. I'm not sure they're very clear on exactly what that means. I think there's a lot of, well, basically, interesting. What would actually trigger them exercising that power under the bill to create it as a separate body?
Okay, thank you. And how far do you think the increased time limit that has been in place for investigating fraud related to the COVID-19 schemes would go to improving recovery rates? A slightly different topic, but do you think that those longer time limits would mean that we're more able to recover that money?
I mean, in short, yes. Would you like a longer
That'd be great.
answer? So look, firstly, I think we should be clear. Most fraud, once it's gone, once the payment has gone, you're not going to get it back. I mean, I've got a professional next to me who can talk to you about the challenges and the pursuit. But if you look at how much fraud there is that's out there, the answer is a lot. During COVID, the official estimates, if you add them all up from the different schemes, is £10.5 billion of fraud. Now, government so far has recovered £1 billion of that, actually mostly by HMRC. Less so from others, and of course HMRC stopped collecting it because they felt that they knew that the resources would have a higher return of investment if they were rediverted back to tax rather than fraud recovery. So you're always onto, I'm afraid, a losing game if you're into the recovery phase, but every million counts, right? It's always nice to get something back. The COVID Counter-Fraud Commissioner has only just been appointed. Their role is to review these and see if there is a way to get it back. My understanding is that with 6 years under the time limit under the Fraud Act 2006, that will be expiring next spring. Therefore, it makes a lot of sense that just in that timetable alone, if the Fraud Commissioner is going to bring forward anything that has a chance of working, you're going to need to give that a little bit more time. Like I say, we are really sceptical that it's possible to get the majority of that 10.5 billion back. Some of it will come back from the bounce back loans anyway, but the vast majority of it's gone. But every million counts.
Absolutely, thank you very much.
You could add anything, Mr. Lass?
I think on the COVID side of things, certainly what we've done is, I mean, we haven't stopped our efforts on COVID. What we've done is we've recognised that we're not going to pursue it as a sort of a lead subject currently, but when we're conducting other inquiries, looking into other taxes, we will be looking at whether there was fraud under the COVID schemes, and we'll still be pursuing them. And I've still got a large number of cases going through the courts and heading towards prosecution in relation to the scheme. So a bit like Joshua, I'm certainly not giving up on it. We'll still keep pursuing it. And what we've done is, in a decision on how we deploy our resources, we're saying we'll look to what we think are the highest risks, and we'll pick up the COVID risks as and when we come across those at the same time.
Thank you. Minister.
Thank you, and thank you both for joining us today. I'm just interested in an overarching question as to what you both think will be the impact of the modernisation of the DWP processes that are proposed, and whether you think they will improve the detection of fraud and error.
Do you mean specifically the EVM
Well,
stuff?
all of the powers pertaining to the DWP, so the 5 principal areas within the DWP's proposals. So also information gathering, debt recovery, penalties reform and powers of search and seizure, but EVM too. Okay.
I think if we step back, we've been looking at a general trend of rising levels of benefit fraud for a few years. I mean, it's actually come down a little bit from COVID because there was a blip, but it's kind of like if you take COVID out, it was rising anyway. And it's currently more than 10 billion if you include the bit of benefits that HMRC pays. Obviously, that's coming down with universal credit, right? I don't think that what's in this bill will solve that. I think what's in this bill will support tackling that. It's about adding a few tools to the toolkit that DWP has. The key thing that we think they should do is prevention is better than recovery. That DWP is really good. I mean, one of the best in the world, as far as we can see, at knowing how much fraud is occurring. I'm afraid it's not very good at saying why it occurs. And that in particular, it's not great at saying what it is about the way it administers benefits that enables fraud to occur or error to happen. So we've been advocating for some time that it gets a much more granular view on its control environment. I think that actually the way I would interpret the capital rules here and the EVM exercise is that it is doing that. It's one of the places where it's gone, actually our control over capital at the moment is frankly to ask people how much capital they've got. And that leaves them fairly exposed to the risk that people do not tell them the truth on that. So the Public Accounts Committee several times asked DWP if it had the powers it needed, and several times it said, well, the one area we need to explore is capital. Now, I think the challenge for this committee is to work out whether or not that proposal is reasonable and has enough oversight given the privacy issues. But in terms of there being a real problem behind it, that I can confirm there is a control level issue that they're trying to resolve. I think the other issues that the bill tries to do around enforcement are similar. They are not, if you look at the impact assessment, that EVM is at 500 million when it's fully rolled out and operational a year. That is a significant dent, but only a dent in the 10 billion. So I just want to, be clear. Yes, I do. Is this sufficient? No. Is it meant to be sufficient? I doubt it. I think they know that. They know that they've got a very hard slog ahead of them, which I will try to hold them to account on. I'm afraid your department, but try to hold DWP to account on for that hard slog of understanding where the fraud is coming in, where the error is happening, and putting in controls step by step to improve it. And there's no shortcuts to that.
Richard?
Yeah. Thank you. So I guess my reflection on this is that fraud is inherently difficult to identify, and it's potentially more difficult to investigate at times. And so how do you identify fraud? If I think about HMRC, you need information. Really, you need to be able to triangulate information to understand the risks in front of you so that you can identify risk, highest risk. Sometimes you won't know what that risk is, whether it's kind of fraud or whether it's error, but it will point you in a direction. So I kind of feel that as an agency, if you've got fraud, you need a good bedrock of information in order to kind of understand the environment and identify risk. A lot of that information can either be information you gather from your customer, in our case a taxpayer, or it's third-party information. So it's information we can use then to triangulate and verify. And we do that regularly with lots of different information sets. I think then once you come to investigate, again, dealing with fraud, it's obvious to everybody, but people don't always cooperate. So you kind of need powers that allow you to either compel people to cooperate, or powers that allow you to secure information and evidence in a way that otherwise you wouldn't be able to do because people wouldn't do that. So kind of the general framework, I mean, we're always looking to improve our kind of basis for powers and our ability to use them. Certainly, I feel much of what's included in the bill is powers that HMRC already has actually in many respects. So, we do use those powers. We use them kind of we would argue in a proportionate and necessary way. And there are kind of controls and safeguards in how we do that. But I think it's a difficult business with fraud. And if you don't have some of those tools at your disposal, you are actually dealing with one arm behind your back.
Thank you. So one follow-up question to each of you separately, if that's okay. So Joshua, you mentioned the challenge that we have at the moment in terms of detecting capital fraud and the reliance that we have on somebody's word as the only real measure that we have in place to determine that. If we were not to pursue EVM, is there another way that you think that we would be able to assure ourselves, beyond just taking the word of a potential claimant, that they don't have more than, for instance, £16,000 in their account?
Is there an alternative? I'm aware that DWP is thinking about open banking as an alternative, but that, of course, would have wider implications, and at the moment is on a voluntary basis. So you've got that. I honestly think what this fundamentally comes down to is if you want to be able to detect, and if Parliament has set an eligibility criteria of capital as part of universal credit and some other benefits, it can either use that as a kind of symbolic deterrent of, can you opt out by owning up that you've got that capital, which is essentially, that has a use, or if you want it to actually be enforced, you've got to provide them with a tool that goes a bit further than just asking. There are various ways you can get data matching from various different partners. This is the one that the government has come up with.
Thank you. And then, Rich, the point you made around the existing powers that HMRC have had, I think, since 2011, to request information on every interest-bearing bank account in the country, as I understand it. Could you just explain, because obviously that feels like a similar bulk data exercise, what safeguards and oversight you have in place, and whether you think that the powers that we are proposing, so the oversight that we're proposing to put in place alongside these powers are equivalent or have more or less oversight than the powers that HMRC have enjoyed for 14 years?
So I think, it's the Finance Act 2011, as you're referring to, and that allows us bulk data gathering powers on information that we believe will be support of our functions. I guess it's not just the banks. But we do get the information on interest-bearing accounts. It's an annual exercise, it's not a real-time exercise. It's clearly timed in such a way that it helps us understand whether or not the right amount of tax has been paid on the interest that's been accrued. And we're talking about large accounts because obviously in most cases people's interest is quite small, but there will be some people that get a lot of it. I mean, we have a huge amount of controls over how we manage that information and how we use it and protect it. I mean, they're kind of our normal requirements set with any other taxpayer data. We do gather other information from third parties. We have information from merchant inquirers on transactions that businesses might make, for example. And we kind of also have information we get from online platforms in terms of sales and things like that as well. So it's all part of the bringing that information together. I think HMRC is well known for we very much respect taxpayer confidentiality and manage that data in a very kind of responsible way. And I guess those safeguards can exist in other organisations.
So just for clarification, is there an independent oversight mechanism in place for the use of those powers?
I don't know, if I'm honest, whether there is on that one. I can look that up
Thank
for
you.
you.
Thanks.
George Gould.
Thank you, and thanks both for your evidence. Firstly, for Joshua, just thinking about the NAO's reports on fraud, and I think the PSFA measures hopefully build on many of those recommendations. So I just really welcome your assessment of the PSFA measures in that light, and any areas you think we should go further.
So my understanding of this, going back, so I think you're referring to the report we did in March 2023? It was, yeah. Which was after PSFA had just been established. We very much wanted it as a baseline for what was the challenges it was trying to deal with. Sorry, my cold coming through.
Don't worry, grab some water, take your time.
But hey, no, what we're basically saying was there needed to be a cultural change across all of government, that all of the resources are essentially in, 84% were in DWP and HMRC.
Yeah.
That COVID had really exposed government did not have the capability in the other departments. I have to say, from our point of view, we had seen fraud as essentially a welfare and a tax issue for many, many years, so it was a bit of a surprise as well to start bringing this out to the other departments a bit more. I think the way I would interpret this bill is about giving the powers, particularly on the enforcement side. I think PSFA in the meantime has been doing quite a lot on the prevention side.
Definitely.
And I think the prevention side is primarily where I would be focused, because I think that is where I think the biggest gains are to be had in dealing with those cultural changes that are needed across all of government. Mind you, I do not read this bill as being against that. I see it as supplementary. I think the areas where we would be very disappointed is if PSFA became exclusively an investigation and enforcement type agency. The impact assessment there at about, roughly 50 million a year. 50 million over 10 years that it thinks it can get from enforcement. Like I say, every million counts. That is very tiny compared to the challenge that PSFA is trying to create. Is that the sort of thing you're
absolutely.
You're interested in?
And I wholeheartedly agree with that. I think there's a massive role around prevention, professionalisation, raising the profile of fraud that sits within that. But I suppose your analysis of how much the deterrent from the measures in the bill will support that prevention agenda.
I think that it is not rare to find what we call audited bodies, government organisations, that have found a fraud, have taken it to as far as they can through their internal services, tried to hand it over to the police to make an arrest, and that file has been fairly developed. And this really gets to the point where it's outside audit, but they've not been able to find anyone that will pick up that file. So the point that we were raised in that 2023 report and that PSFA were trying to deal with was, how can you get an organisation that fills the gap, that helps defend the government when it gets attacked? Because the police are basically going to say government is big enough and ugly enough to look after itself on this. When we looked at fraud more widely across society, in a report that we did later in 2023, we found that at that time it was 40% of all crime. It was 1% of police resources. 40%, 1%. And I think that's what you're trying to tackle here. So you're trying to have an organisation which fills the gap on enforcement. How important is that? I think it is about a deterrent. I think if you get it right, it should also be about root cause analysis. So by which I mean, if you've got an investigation and you're fully able to investigate it, it's not just about prosecuting that person. It's about properly understanding why that happened in the first place, and improving it. So I always wonder a little bit about if you're an organisation, you're outsourcing your investigation to another party, whether or not they'll do that bit of the loop. I'm hopeful that PSFA will develop that capability.
That's a very helpful
to do that.
Yeah.
But that's my understanding of this. All I would say is, like I say, our one concern is please don't let this be the tail that's wagging the dog.
Well made.
Sian-Berry.
Thank you, Chair. Just to follow up on that point, the bill is called the Fraud, Error and Recovery Bill. Do you feel like there's enough built in to identify and deal with errors? I think, like you say, there may be things that are systemic, that are uncovered, that are causing errors or losses that are not in fact fraud. Does that get fed back? Would you like to see more in the bill that sort of systematises that?
Interesting. Look, the reason we always talk about error as well as fraud together is because they're often really difficult to differentiate between them when you're doing prevention. So in my job, I am more interested in fraud and error together because I'm more interested in how to correct that and stop the money going out. If you are in Richard's job, I'm sure he will tell you in a second, he's going to be interested in the one that you can prosecute to an extent. You say?
No, I'm happy to jump in from an HMRC perspective. I mean, so it is important to understand what the driver is. I think that's absolutely right. And to be able to distinguish between fraud and error. So, I mean, we have estimates for fraud and error in terms of the tax system, which we publish every year, and we identify or we kind of generate those estimates for a lot of different activity, but partly it's the result of our own inquiries. So we're analysing what we do, what we see, we make a judgment, is it fraud, is it error, and we'll work out what's going on. And absolutely, you have to look at the underlying reasons. So if there's an error, and a repeated error, what's going on there? What's the cause of it? Certainly, as we develop our business in HMRC, we're very much looking to kind of, especially people filing online, to prompt people so that they can actually get the right answer. For those of you that do self-assessment, hopefully you'll see that yourself, where it actually says, are you sure? Is this information correct? Those sorts of things. But that really does help in reducing errors and the simple errors that people might make because it's complicated. So
because there's errors that might be mistaken for fraud, given their outcome of people paying less or...
Potentially, but they go both ways often. So, sometimes people will overpay as well.
I think there's... if I jump back in it, if you're looking at a particular case and it's normally the first thing you detect is it's wrong. The transaction is not correct. You then have to take it to a certain level before you can work out, in the balance of probabilities, what is this? Whether it's tax world, is it evasion or avoidance or so on. There, and then you go down a different route depending on how you're dealing with it. And obviously, if you want to go prosecution, you have to have much more evidence, and you have to be beyond reasonable doubt to go there. I think the reason why my understanding PSFA often deals with both is because it's at that earlier stage of dealing with prevention, and it's not always clear which one you're dealing with, and besides which we want to stop error as well. My job is to definitely try and stop both through audit and accountability. I think where it doesn't make sense for PSFA to get involved is where that fundamental responsibility for correcting the control environment belongs with the departments. So I think if you see this as they've done that triaging, they now think that it's fraud, you need an enforcement capability, and you go down that route. But I would be very disappointed if that meant others weren't going, in that triage process, things that error wasn't being dealt with. Does that explain?
Yeah, it does. Do you think the bill does enough to deal with that issue?
I'm saying I don't think this bill is about that issue.
Okay, even with the title?
Even with that title.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Chair. And Joshua, you spoke about the bill's sort of dual powers, both prevention, if you like, and recovery. And I'm just wondering whether it's possible to quantify or estimate a percentage or a lump sum figure for how much is expected to be saved from people who know they can no longer attempt to diddle by not declaring capital or whatever it might be or anything in multiple accounts? Are you able to put a figure on that, or would you look for implementation before working on figures?
Sorry, on how much fraud is created from...
How much this legislation will prevent people trying to fiddle the system, basically. Because there will be people who are aware of the new powers who then don't do it, is the point you're talking about when it comes to sort of prevention.
So is this the behavioural effect that they've talked about?
Yeah.
I haven't done anything that adds to the information that's already in the impact assessment. So I've not audited it, so I think I'll just point to the numbers in there. I know that there is that issue around, will people split their money between multiple bank accounts? Is that also part of what you're referring to? Yeah. I mean, I've spoken to DWP and the OBR about it. I think my understanding, frankly, is that it's an area of uncertainty and that they wanted to make an adjustment because they knew that there would be an effect. They do not know what that is. And I think we'll have to come back and see what that is. But I think that for me, the more fundamental point is that this power will not stop all fraud.
No.
It is designed to stop some. Will there be behavioural effects that will limit that? Yes. Does that in itself mean you shouldn't try? No.
But as the new powers are rolled out, obviously where people attempt fraud and a recovery effort is there, that will be clear, that will be quantifiable. Will you be able to put a figure? Will you be assessing in any way how much of a deterrent it's been to have the new powers, including the access to bank accounts, for example?
I think, well, my first instance, I would ask DWP how it was going to do that, because that's how the wonderful world of audit works.
Of course.
Secondly, I would suggest to them that they can establish a baseline, because this is pretty transparent within their published statistics. You've got a breakdown in there of how much fraud is created by, well, how much is caused by people misstating their capital. And the reason that they're able to do that is because fundamentally, when you apply for a benefit, you do not have to provide your bank statement. But when you are subject to an inquiry that informs the statistics, you do have to provide your bank statements. And the statistic is generated by the difference between those two processes. And that will continue to be the case after this power is enacted.
Thank you.
Thank you. Could I just come back to a question following on from one of my colleagues' earlier questions around error and the ability of the bill to clamp down, look at error? Would it be your view, Joshua, that the eligibility verification measure, in addition to identifying instances of capital fraud or people living abroad, etc., or being abroad for longer than they should be, there is also the potential for it to capture overpayments that are being made, and therefore ultimately have the benefit of reducing the level of debt that somebody might find themselves in were they to have that go undetected for a longer period of time?
I think that's a fair comment, given that I said that it doesn't really deal with error, and I was really referring to the enforcement powers under the under PSFA, and because as I say, I think PSFA do other stuff that's in the error space, but not the enforcement stuff isn't. The enforcement stuff for DWP won't really be in the error space as well, but you're quite right, any data matching is an opportunity to detect error. And DWP are used to that, aren't they? So, for example, when they're doing targeted targeted case reviews, that will be detecting error as well as fraud. What we know from the statistics is DWP believes there's more fraud than error in that space. But I accept your premise of your question entirely, and I should have made clear that part is.
And one more, if I may. Richard, just noting that one of the powers that we intend to take is around powers of search and seizure for the DWP when investigating serious and organised crime. That's a power that HMRC have had for some time. Could you reflect on what the benefits of that have been for HMRC's operations in terms of no longer needing to rely directly on the police to fulfil that function?
Well, I mean, ultimately, it allows us to operate immediately and with real clarity, and we're under the same kind of governance and restrictions as the police would be in terms of we have to go to a court to get those warrants. But in terms of our ability to...
Order. We've come to the end of the allotted time. Can I thank the witnesses for their evidence, and we'll move on to the next part. Right, we'll now hear oral evidence from John Smart, formerly partner for forensics at Ernst & Young, and who sits on the Public Sector Fraud Authority Advisory Panel. We have until 10 minutes till 3 o'clock. Mike Wood.
Thank you, Sir Desmond. Obviously, one of at the heart of this bill is establishing the PFSA as a separate body outside of the Cabinet Office. What do you see as the practical benefits that move will bring? How will we better be able to serve the public sector?
I think being fully independent would probably be helpful. Although in terms of the realistic practical impact of that, I suspect it will be more theoretical rather than practical in the short term. Maybe in the longer term, a fully independent standalone organisation would be much more helpful.
And in terms of that independence, how would you see that interacting with the decision-making processes within the bill that largely rely on ministerial or departmental decisions in terms of the orders for information? I think that needs to be determined in terms of the overall governance structure of the organisation as and when it was set up, because clearly it would need to have an independent board, and some of those oversight powers that are being proposed in the bill would need to be independent of the management of that business as well. So I think it would require quite a lot of thought about the overall governance structure, the way it operates, and the way the day-to-day management of the business is independent of the oversight powers. Obviously, this is a bill very much of two halves, and many of the powers that will be given to PSFA are equivalent to those that are being given to DWP investigators. The obvious difference is the use of reasonable force. Now, do you think that the nature of PSFA investigations means that this won't really be required for PSFA investigations, or do you think your powers should also include reasonable force?
I think, as you say, the nature of the investigations that will be carried out by the PSFA will be quite different from those being carried out by the DWP. And I think certainly the proposal in the bill is that investigations that require some form of search warrant will be carried out with a police officer present, and therefore the powers that are being given to DWP in relation to this bill will be already sitting with the police that will be accompanying any investigators that are doing work on behalf of the PSFA. That's as I understand it at the moment.
For a lot of the provisions in the bill, those in receipt of orders potentially have a very short time frame to comply with the demands.
Yes.
Based on your experience with the PSFA so far, is that consistent with the length of time it, in most cases, takes such organisations to reply to requests for information?
The consistency question is an interesting one. I think a lot of those powers are likely to be applied specifically in relation to banks and telecoms companies. They already have procedures in place to respond to requests for information. And therefore, the majority of cases, my suspicion is those short timeframes will be consistent with what they're normally dealing with. So it won't be a big onus on them to change the way they operate normally.
But the provisions of the bill aren't confined to financial institutions.
No, and I think I don't know what institutions are likely to be required to provide information. There'll be individuals, there'll be institutions. Other institutions might find it more difficult, but there is an appeals process in relation to provision of information which they can apply to use, which, if it's unreasonably onerous, I suspect will mean that the timescale will be varied.
So, and the legislation obviously sets out a specific period of time for a lot of those.
Yes.
So would it be logical to assume that for some smaller businesses, it may take longer for them to comply than multinational banks that are doing this regularly?
That is true. The challenge, however, and having spent 35 years investigating fraud, there is a need to be reasonably speedy and be able to do these investigations, because, as we heard earlier, any recoveries are going to be much reduced if there's a significant delay in carrying out the investigation and applying for either criminal or civil proceedings to take place. And therefore, speed is important in any investigation. Otherwise, you're sort of spending a lot of time and effort without getting the result you need.
And so just to give us, obviously who haven't been involved in such direct investigations, some idea of the quantum we're talking about, what period of time do you think would count as reasonably speedy so that it wouldn't endanger an investigation? We're talking days, weeks, months?
I think weeks is reasonable, and a short number of weeks is a reasonable number to look for, rather than days or months. Months is far too long, days is probably a little too short in relation to the ability of organisations to respond.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Minister?
Thank you. Just a very general question, I guess, to open with. I mean, you will be more aware than I of the changing nature of fraud and the increasing sophistication that we see from perpetrators. Do you agree in general that the powers of the DWP would need to be modernised at present in order to cope with that shift? And what are your views on the general provisions within the bill where it pertains to the DWP to detect and prevent fraud?
The risk of echoing what's been said before, I think it is critical that we modernise the approach to fraud, and this bill is a good step towards that modernisation. I think the critical part of a lot of investigations now and identifying, preventing, detecting fraud is the use of data, and getting that data / information quickly and effectively is critical. And I think this bill will get a long way to A, speeding up, and B, broadening the breadth of information that's available that can be used to prevent and detect and prosecute fraud. And I think that's a really valuable thing that we should be pushing for, because I think relying on pieces of paper to seek information from organisations is crazy in this day and age, when you can do it electronically and you can get an answer relatively quickly. Whereas if you're turning up with a piece of paper, it can take weeks and months.
Thank you.
Rebecca Smith?
Thank you, Chair. Obviously, with your experience and the work that you're already doing with the PSFA, are there any gaps in this bill, anything that you think isn't there to help us tackle fraud against public authorities, or do you think that as it stands it's about as complete as you would want it to be?
Having worried about this for a number of years, I think there are a lot of steps that the government, the PSFA, can take over time, but we're on a sort of a ladder to get to a position which is constantly moving because the fraudsters are developing all the time. I think one of the critical things that I've been concerned about for a number of years is the use and the sharing of data across government. Government has so much data available to it, and third parties have a lot of data available to them. There's clearly a privacy question that rapidly comes into play, but from my perspective, if the data is available to government, it should use it. It should use it proportionately, and it shouldn't exploit those powers to be using those data on some sort of fishing trip. But if there is evidence that a fraud is being committed or has been committed, then getting that evidence quickly in the hands of the investigators is critical to preventing the fraud continuing and to identify and recover any money that's been lost. So to my mind, there's quite a lot of work still to be done on data sharing across government.
And do you think, given what you've just said about the nature of what data is already collected, that there's almost a position where we could be avoiding the fraud in the first place because a lot of that information is shared? Have you seen opportunities where that might exist, where that kind of cross-departmental working, if it was tightened up, could actually mean that the fraud, maybe it started to happen, but it flagged as soon as it was taking place? Is that something that...
Well, there's 2 points. One, there's that one, which is frauds are happening, and if the data was shared more effectively, more quickly, it would be identified. The other point is where you can prevent fraud by joining up data that might be sitting in Companies House, that might be sitting within, the licensing authority, whatever. If you join that data together, you can find where there's evidence that there is a fraud carrying out, and then you can prevent frauds coming in the first place.
And interestingly, one more question, if I may. One of the other witnesses earlier on this today talked about some of the powers that other countries have that we don't have, that would potentially do exactly what you've just suggested. Are there any particular countries that, perhaps not within this bill, but in the future we should be looking to, who are already doing something along the lines of what you've just suggested that could be helpful?
An obvious case, which I dealt quite a lot with the United States, which is an interesting case in point at the moment, but the US does have whistleblower reward legislation in place, which is very effective at flushing out issues that affect payments made by government. And their Quitan legislation, as it's called, does flush out frauds because it incentivises whistleblowers to blow the whistle. Now, it does create a lot of work for various organisations, but it does encourage people to think about whether there's a fraud that is being committed against the government happening in the US. So that's an obvious piece of legislation that might be worth considering in this country.
Thank you.
Georgiana Gould.
And as an advisor to the PSFA, I suppose you've seen the organisation grow, and I wondered if you give your assessment of where you think the PSFA are in tackling public sector fraud and how this bill moves us on.
That's a big question. Yes, I've been involved with the Cabinet Office for over 12 years, so the whole inception of the PSFA came about whilst I've been working with the Cabinet Office. I think it's got a long way in the 18 months since it was formed to having a better understanding of where the issues sit across government. And I think clearly where it plays best is outside DWP and HMRC, where when I first got involved in, and my passion has been trying to identify where fraud is taking place, which is something I was working on for the past 10 years, is trying to identify the size of fraud in government, which is, as you all know, is very hard to quantify because it's hidden, it's unknown. And I think the PSFA has gone a long way and is continuing to go a long way to flushing out where resources should be committed to preventing, investigating and deterring fraud across government outside HMRC and DWP. And I think that is critical because when I first started asking departments where frauds were within their departments, they said there's nothing to see here broadly. So at least now there's a recognition, particularly given the work that the PSFA have been doing, that there is a real issue to be addressed and that it's not just expenses frauds or whatever it was it used to be that they used to think it was.
And I also, with Chair's permission, had a question about the information gathering powers and timings, building on the previous questions. The current proposition is that will be a minimum of 10 days, but that can be longer in discussion with the business and proportionate to their size, that the business or organisation would be able to request a review of that if they felt it was too onerous. And I just wondered if you felt that was a kind of proportionate position to be in terms of information gathering powers and also safeguards.
I think, as we said earlier, the larger organisations will be geared up to help provide that information within the time frame required. Some of the smaller organisations might struggle to meet that 10-day requirement. But I still think it's a reasonable starting point, because if you don't start with a reasonable starting point for the larger organisations, you end up just deferring decision making and action to be taken. So I think 10 days is a reasonable.
So having that explicitness that that is a minimum, it can go further based on those conversations. That's very helpful. Thank you.
If there are no further questions, can I thank John Smart for his evidence, and we'll move on to the next panel. Yeah. We'll now hear oral evidence from Eric Leenders and Daniel Cichocki, both from UK Finance, and we have until 10 minutes past 3 o'clock. Mike Wood.
Thank you very much. What consultation has there been with industry in terms of making sure that the eligibility verification measures are workable and that your members will know what is required of them?
So there's been a number of conversations with the industry since the measure was announced, and we've been very clear since its announcement that we are very supportive of the efforts to tackle fraud and error in the public sector. We recognise the scale of the challenge that the government faces, and as a private sector we very much see the damage that fraud does to both the public and private sector. So we're very supportive of the objective of the bill. There's been a number of conversations on this measure since its announcement. As you say, I think the key thing for us as a sector that is heavily regulated, both from a vulnerable customer treatment stance that my colleague Eric Leenders is best placed to talk to, and from a financial crime compliance perspective, that the specific details of how the measure will work are more detail, I think, is still to emerge through the code of practice, but there's extensive conversations underway. I think from the banking industry perspective, what we are keen to see and ensure is that the requirements for compliance on banks is very clear in terms of what information is required, and for instance we hope to see in the code of practice as sort of soon as practical the levels of detail in terms of the specific criteria which the government will mandate banks to perform checks against under the measure.
And do you think that banks have any kind of sense of how many information notices and other applications they're likely to receive? Do you think there's any expectation at all as to the scale of the undertaking?
So I think we're still awaiting a bit more detail. We've obviously had high-level indicators that the government is likely to use the measure to require banks to check against, which gives us some sense as to the scale. I think our initial assessment is that it's likely to be significant, but I think the key thing for us as we move forward is that more detailed level of criteria that the government will require us to check against under the measure.
And so for a typical bank, do you have any idea what, for example, the additional man hours or potentially cost burden could be in a typical year?
I think it's quite difficult at this stage to perform that level of assessment, partly because so much detail of the measure will be set out in the code of practice. We are obviously very keen to ensure that complying with the new requirement that the expectations are proportionate on the industry, but it's difficult to do that assessment in detail before we see the detail of the code of practice. Much will depend, for instance, on the mechanism through which banks will be required to share the information, the scale of frequency of the information notices, and factors such as whether the criteria that we are required to run the checks against changes over time. So those are some of the factors that will influence how much capacity is required from the banking sector. But I say at this stage it's sort of challenging to do much more of a detailed assessment.
But presumably, going back to the evidence we've just heard from the previous witness, you'd agree that the banks are in general probably reasonably well adapted to be able to respond to such notices. So in the case of banks, the 10 days might be reasonable. Do you think that's...
So we're certainly currently sharing very significant amounts of information with various government departments and law enforcement to ensure kind of compliance with the tackling of economic crime. That's something that we take very seriously. We continue at present to share extensive information with DWP where there's suspicion of fraud at present. So there's certainly a setup to respond to information requests. I think the challenge or the difference with this particular measure that we're keen to ensure consideration is given to is obviously that this information request is looking for information to tackle both fraud and error. A lot of the work that we do as an industry at present in terms of information sharing with government and law enforcement is very much focused on suspected fraud, economic crime, serious and organised crime. This is a slightly broader measure and that's one aspect that we've been keen to ensure that just going back to my earlier point, we're keen to see in the code of practice a very clear set of requirements on banks to comply with, but the infrastructure is certainly there.
And is there any measure of how long it currently takes banks to respond to requests for information from government, from HMRC under existing powers?
So there's a variety of powers that exist to date. Some have time measures built into compliance with them. A number of them are voluntary. I think one factor with this particular power is just ensuring that it's balanced against all of the existing information sharing that the industry is required to do, both with government and in law enforcement, and particularly that it's balanced against voluntary sharing that the industry is doing, particularly with law enforcement. Certainly for those of us working in economic crime, our focus is primarily on how can we work with government and law enforcement to tackle serious and organised crime. So striking the balance between the additional requirements under this power and that effort is an area of focus that we've been engaged with government on as well.
And are there any other areas where you think that either this bill could be approaching things differently, or indeed is there anything that you think should be in this bill that's missing?
I think just in terms of the eligibility verification measure, I think given that that is perhaps one of the more extensive powers within this bill, we think it may be appropriate that this power also has the Minister attest to the fact that the use of it is proportionate, as is required within the other measures in this bill, just because the scale of this particular power requiring banks to share information on both potential fraud and potential error, and the sharing of that information of customers that, as I say, may not be suspected of any crime whatsoever. We think it would just be helpful for that articulation and government judgment that the measure is proportionate applies to that measure as with others. The other suggestion we think it would be helpful for this bill to explore is there's a very effective Proceeds of Crime Act exemption within the eligibility verification measure. We think it would be helpful for that exemption to be replicated in the other measures across both Part 1 and Part 2 of the bill. The reason for that is simply we don't think it's necessarily proportionate or helpful for banks to be considering that in complying with the legislation, whether they also should be undertaking a suspicious activity report to the authorities. And I think one of the constructive conversations we've been having with government is how do we delineate our responsibilities to comply with this legislation versus our responsibilities to comply with financial crime. So we would suggest, and we'll be writing with more detail on this suggestion, that exemption, which is very helpful under the eligibility verification measure, that's replicated in other elements of the bill.
Great, thank you very much.
Minister?
Thank you. And thank you for joining us today, and also thank you for the engagement that we've had so far, because it has been incredibly helpful, and you have my assurance that it will continue. Just to test the point that you've just set out there around the POCA measure within EVM and rolling that out more broadly. Clearly, We do want to ensure that the burdens on banks that arise as a result of the EVM measure, but also any of the other measures, interplay in an acceptable manner with the broad range of duties that fall upon you. The consumer duty would be another one. Could you, just in the interest of transparency, I think the committee set out the other concerns and that you have around what may be potentially in conflict with some of this if we do not get things right as we construct the code of practice?
So I think one of the reasons we're making the suggestion is at present, as we consider the measures, what we would have to consider as banks is whether in responding to an information request or in responding to a direct deduction order, whether we would have to conclude that there is some indication of financial crime that would require us under the POCA legislation to make a suspicious activity report. So we think it's simpler to simply remove that requirement, not least because where there's a requirement to make a suspicious activity report, that is in order to notify the authorities, and clearly in complying with the measure, there is a notification to the authorities going on. We just think it's simpler and it avoids the potential risk that banks are having to consider, as well as how do we respond to the measure. Are we also required to treat that individual account as a potential fraudulent account? And obviously what we're trying to do more broadly with financial crime compliance is to manage risk out of the system. So that's the reason we think it's much more proportionate and effective to simply apply the same exemption across all of the measures within the bill.
Thank you. And obviously, you know, I'm really hopeful that through the informal conversations, but also the formal consultation that we're required to have on the code of practice, we will be able to stack this up in a way that everything interplays in an acceptable way. You did briefly mention their direct deduction orders. Just turning to the debt recovery power specifically, I know that you have some concerns about that measure, and just an opportunity really to set those out if there's anything that you wanted to elaborate on beyond what you've just said about that particular element of the powers that we're proposing.
Yeah, thank you, Minister. So I think there's sort of two or three key areas for us. First is the affordability assessment, and I think previously you've heard perhaps the use of the standard financial statement would be helpful in outlining essential monthly expenditure. I'll come back to that point. Second, I think that the caps differ between the PFSA and DWP, and we think that perhaps they should be aligned with the 40-20 split that PFSA also applied to the DWP. And then we think it's quite important that there's some form of de minimis such that individuals don't find that they are without any funds whatsoever. Our thinking is something aligned to perhaps in Scotland there's a £1,000 threshold, HMRC about £5,000, £2,000 potentially for partners from child maintenance. So what we were thinking was potentially there should be a floor, but more essentially there needs to be a consideration of 1 month's essential expenditure. That would allow for the individual to readjust their expenditure in the period that they need to consider making the payments under deduction, or indeed the balances.
So within the proposals, we're looking to set on the DWP side a maximum of 40% of somebody's total capital that we would be able to deduct as a lump sum. Would that satisfy you, or would you like us to look further at that?
I think we'd like to consider what a specific de minimis might look like, and certainly, as I say, there's probably two approaches. One would be an absolute amount, and the other would be a relative amount dependent on the individual's essential expenditure. So it's not a lifestyle expenditure, and that's why we feel the standard financial statement would be a useful tool.
Thank you.
Thank you. Charles Dewhurst.
I'm right, Chair. My questions will be answered. So.
Very good. Sierra Berry.
Thank you, Chair.
Just wanted to go back and ask if there were any other issues within your consumer duties, particularly towards vulnerable account holders, that you've raised with the government. I know that the Minister's helpfully asked you that in general, but I just thought that there may be other issues. And then if I can also go back to Daniel's comment earlier on about, can you clarify that you don't have a clue yet what the volume of requests would be like, or have you had some sort of estimate given to you by the government?
So shall I take that
if you
question
can take that well, yeah.
First? I mean, there's obviously, pertaining to the eligibility verification measure, there's obviously two potential broad criteria that the government set out, both the capital check and the check against abroad fraud through assessments of transactions abroad. It has been difficult at this stage because the industry has not undertaken any detailed collective analysis on what the criteria against the current book of customers is. So that work hasn't yet been done. We anticipate it being done through the development of the Code of Practice, but I think key for us is understanding exactly what criteria will be required to run, and then of course banks can start to build an assessment of how that looks against their current book, but that detailed work hasn't taken place yet.
Okay, and just to follow up directly on that, the government hasn't really been that clear yet which further benefits in future might be added to the workload. Are you happy that this is left open within the bill?
So I don't think we take a view on the scope of individual benefits to which this is applied. I think the key principle for us is that where there's changes to the eligibility criteria, we are required to check that there's proper public consultation around those changes, that there's an appropriate period of implementation for any of those changes, and that those changes aren't too frequent, because every time we have to, as an industry, build a system to run these checks, every change will have to be built and tested. So for us, it's more about the principle about the frequency and appropriateness of the changes. The broader debate around what's in scope is not one we've taken a view on.
But those are helpful things to know. Sorry, did you have any more to say about vulnerable customers? I know we've had some representations from disabled people, for example.
Yeah, certainly. And just if I may, just to build on Dan's point regarding change requirements, to give a picture of the time span involved. Typically a change would involve the build, so IT systems change, training, which is policy and procedures. We'd also need to think about communications, including potentially into terms and conditions, so the legals that sit around that. We'd want to build monitoring systems so that we can ensure that we've got conformance and some form of review process. We have sort of a three-line of defence model where the business runs the business, the second line checks the business, and the third line checks the checkers, so to speak. And then we repeat that cycle. So putting that in place takes some time, which rather illustrates Dan's desire for fewer changes and additions, because all of that would need to be considered. The point on vulnerability, I think, is very well made. There's a slight health warning in my comments because the Financial Conduct Authority is due to publish findings from a thematic review imminently, as I understand, within the next couple of months. But the broad drivers that we adhere to, that they identify, are around financial resilience. We've touched on that point a little earlier. Health, both physical and mental, and I think there can be potentially some mental strains for individuals who feel they may be under suspicion, particularly where those prove not to be founded. Life events also, I think, are critical. They are key in affordability, typically the driver for financial difficulty, and also capability. There's various measures, but we typically as an industry would work to a reading age of 9 to ensure that the UK population understands the communications that they receive. So in building out the guidance, I think it would be very helpful for a period of consultation such that we can get into the detail and the more forensics around those points.
Thank you very much. Can I just ask one final follow-up?
Very quickly.
So I know that disabled people receiving direct payments have expressed some concern that there can be underspends, these can build up, and they would ask for a particular account to be ring-fenced for that and essentially not looked at in relation to these measures. Is that a feasible thing? And what's your lead time for knowing you'd need to do it? Would it need to go into the bill initially?
It would always be within the gift of a consumer to open a separate account, and they can then ask for the benefit to be paid into that account. I think there might be a risk from a wider perspective that potentially attorneys and landlords might no longer want to receive benefits direct because of the potential admin burdens through this particular bill. I flag that as a consideration. I don't think that's necessarily a showstopper, but certainly it's something I think we need to be, from a vulnerability perspective, alive to, because that might be an additional responsibility on a vulnerable person, for example, to pay the rent, etc. Georgia Gould.
I'd just like to echo Minister Weston's points about the really strong level of engagement. Really welcome the conversations that we've had and I know are ongoing with our teams. I suppose on the PSFA side of the bill, I heard what you said about potential exemptions, but are there any other areas that you would like us to be really working on in detail on as we move forward?
No, I think the key thing for us, as I said, in relation to DWP measures, is now starting to look at the detail of the draft regulations, the code of practices that sit behind the powers, but which we're looking forward to engage on. But I think our sort of broader observations are more on the DWP side. I mean, across both elements of the bill, we welcome very strongly the sort of independent review processes that have been built into the powers. We think potentially the scope of those reviews could just consider some of the other factors that we know have been raised as questions around these powers. So, for instance, could there be more direct scope for that independent reviewer to consider some of the unintended consequences, impact on vulnerable customers, and the cost of compliance? Those are sort of just some broader points on the independent reviewer, but I think the principle of having one across both elements of the bill is important.
Brilliant, thank you very much.
Rebecca Smith.
Thank you, Chair. We've seen that there's been so far a lack of robust assessment of business costs. The government hasn't been able to provide what the cost to your kind of the banks and etc. is going to be. Do you have any concerns about the costs or the other impacts on businesses in the sectors? And I suppose the flip question of that is, do you think there should be any incentives to get them to actually work with it? Because it feels to me like there's a huge amount of good faith going on here, that banks are expected to bear the costs of providing this information, but are there unforeseen costs we need to be concerned about as well?
So I think in terms of broad principles, obviously wherever there's additional legislation and regulation on the sector, we would hope that that is proportionate, and we anticipate doing further work with government to help support the impact assessment as a result of the more detailed work, when we see the draft code of practice, when we're better able to understand the methods through which this information will be shared, the practicalities of how it works, and the scale at which the powers will be used. So we anticipate more work to be done around the impact assessment. We would hope and anticipate that the government would recognise that that needs to be proportionate on the private sector. And as well as the implications on the cost of resource, it's also around prioritisation. To my earlier point around many of these teams that will be complying with this legislation will be currently complying with the broader legislation and regulation that we have in place, sharing information with government and law enforcement. So ensuring there's a proportionality of how that resource is deployed, and certainly from an industry perspective, a broad principle is we would see it as much more appropriate and desirable for as much of that big resource to be focused on serious and organised crime in the round.
So I think if I may, just a couple of brief builds. First, I think one consideration is congestion. There's quite a crowded mandatory change stack, as we would call it. So there's a sequence of changes in train that firms are already implementing. Second, to your specific point about cost-benefit analysis, I think we recognise the challenge that the costs will be direct, as in the build costs that we've just summarised. The benefits are perhaps more indirect in reducing criminality generally, and perhaps equally deterring, preventing maybe, but certainly deterring criminality. Which does, I suppose, lead to another point, the extent to which we do need to be thoughtful about circumvention and how we can ensure that this legislation is suitably agile, such that bad actors aren't able to game the system no sooner than it has been introduced.
Great, thank you.
There being no further questions, I'll thank the panel for their evidence, our witnesses for their evidence, and we'll move on to the next panel. Thank you. We'll now hear from Ellen Lefley, senior lawyer at Justice, and we have until 3:30. Rebecca Smith.
Thank you, Chair. I'll let you while you're getting your water. You've just heard the previous questions where we've talked, I suppose, about the cost-benefit analysis for businesses in the private sector. With your kind of justice work, what's your assessment of the proportionality of the measures in the bill that are essentially saying to these financial institutions they have to share this information with DWP, and what do you perceive to be the cost versus benefit of that as well?
Yeah, thank you. So in relation to that bank power, which is of course the eligibility verification measure, I think it's right that one is separated out in terms of proportionality, because I think what's really important just to clarify is that all the other information, search, entry, seizure powers that are extended in the bill to the PSFA and to DWP all contain this threshold form of words of needing a reasonable grounds of suspicion, reasonable grounds of belief. That threshold for the exercise of state power that requires reasonableness, objectivity, and therefore for there to be something there, and it's that rule of law barrier that prevents fishing expeditions and prevents state intervention in people's lives when there's simply nothing to it. And any form of words like that is missing from the eligibility verification measure, which is why the privacy concerns and concerns around the proportionality of the measure have been so concentrated. Justice is concerned about the proportionality of those measures, precisely because it doesn't have that threshold of reasonable suspicion, because of the vast numbers that could be subject to it, albeit I know that the state pension has been taken out of scope, and it was in scope before with the almost equivalent measure that was in the DPDI bill last year. But it's the broadness of that power, the lack of the threshold, and the fact that it's engaging that fundamental right of privacy. We all have a right to privacy, and we also all have a right to enjoy our privacy in a non-discriminatory way. I suppose that's also the further issue that I would raise would be, and I'm sure others will raise it today, would be the almost inevitable disproportionate impact that those financial surveillance, they can be called powers, will have on people who are disabled. There hasn't been a quality impact assessment released yet with this bill, but there was with the last, and that one, actually I don't think it was released, I think it was subject to an FOI, but I did have sight of it, and it did reveal that even though I think around 23% of the population at large are disabled, of the benefits receiving population, it's around 50%. So there is that prima facie disparity of the financial privacy that's enjoyed by citizens in this country and people residing here, that is less protected for those people than others. And of course that will very much needs to be proportionate and justifiable given those fundamental rights that are engaged.
Great. Just following on the eligibility verification, if I may, we know that the government has said that the final decision on that will always be made by a human. So although there's an aim to automate some things, which, 2025 is probably not a bad thing necessarily, do you feel reassured by that kind of human element at the end of the process that people will not be adversely affected by that automation, or are you still concerned that that's not going to be far enough and good enough?
I think reassurance can't be the word, unfortunately, just given the moment we're in. As you say, increasing automation, increasing investment in data analytics and machine learning across government. We had, I think it was last month, the government statements to mainline AI into the veins of the nation, and that includes the public sector, right? So I think knowing that that's coming and that needing to be within clear focus of how the functions within this bill will be operationalised, I think it needs to be a key concern. The preservation of human intervention within decision making may have been a statement that's been made, but it isn't on the face of the bill. And indeed, we also need to remember that the Data Use and Access Bill, which is also currently before Parliament, is actually removing the prohibition on fully automated decision making and profiling. That is happening concurrently with these powers going forward. And then in addition to that, I think there have been numerous scandals over the years which are horizon-like but have actually happened within the benefits area, one of which, quite close to home in the Netherlands, was a childcare benefits scandal which members of the committee I'm sure will know of. And in that scandal, recipients of childcare benefit allowance within the Netherlands were subject to a machine learning algorithm which learnt to flag a fraud risk simply because of their dual nationality. And so there is a real problem here with even with the powers that are subject to reasonable grounds. We need to be having a much wider discussion as to what reasonable means and what it definitely doesn't mean when we're talking about reasonable grounds of suspicion, when suspicion is an exercise which is being informed by, in a tech-assisted, techno-social decision-making environment. Justice actually has some suggestions as to how reasonable grounds can be better glossed within this bill to make sure that generalisations and stereotypes that a certain type of person, simply because of their characteristics, is more likely to commit fraud than others, perhaps that could be recorded on the face of the bill that definitely isn't reasonable. There is actually some useful wording from the Police and Criminal Evidence Act Code of Practice A, which isn't being borrowed into the bill because it relates to search and stop and search, which isn't being given to DWP officers, I think probably quite rightly and proportionately. But within the Code of Practice for stop and search for police officers, there are some explicit paragraphs that say you can't stop and search someone based on their protected characteristics within the Equality Act, and you can't be exercising your discretion to stop and search someone due to generalisations and stereotypes about a certain type of person's propensity to commit criminal activity. And I think potentially amendments like those could strengthen this bill against unreasonable but perhaps not always detectable suspicions being imbued by machine learning algorithms. And of course, if there always will be a human intervention in the decision-making process, perhaps that could be explicitly recorded in the bill as well.
Great, thank you.
Minister?
Thank you. Just to the last point that you made around stop and search and decisions being made purely based on protected characteristics, and it speaks to what you said earlier around the perceived impact on disabled people. Are you suggesting that the eligibility verification measure would directly discriminate against disabled people, or is it merely that disabled people make up a larger number of the cohort?
They make up a larger number of the cohort, so there's we would analyse a prima facie indirect discrimination potential risk there, which would then need to be justified as being necessary and proportionate. And so therefore the proportionality assessment, of course, is for Parliament, but we consider that both a significant amount of scrutiny is required, not only because of the privacy impacts, but also because there is that clear indirect discrimination aspect as well. But not just, I'm not alleging direct. Yeah.
And so would that be the case in any preventative measure that we took in pursuit of tackling benefit fraud that did not come about as a direct result of suspicion of fraud? So anything that we tried to do with the entire cohort, would we be open up to that accusation?
I think raising the risk of indirect discrimination when you have cohorts of the population which are disproportionately reflected in any sub-community of the population that will be exposed to any power is a relevant consideration. And so yes, in that respect, I think the proportionality measure when it comes to the proportionality analysis, when it comes to the eligibility verification measures, is so in our view, strained because there isn't that threshold of reasonable suspicion. The mere fact that benefits recipients are in receipt of public funds is the thing that is making them subject to this power, which of course could go broader. I mean, I think all the public servants and MPs in this room are in receipt of public funds. So if that's the threshold that we as a society are happy with, then I think there is some real scrutiny of the proportionality of that is required, because it's a power which can require private financial information.
So I suppose then I'd be interested in your view on proportionality as a direct response to what has been a £35 billion challenge for the department since COVID. So given the increasing prevalence of both fraud and error, but particularly fraud with an estimated upwards of £7 billion, whether you would consider that to be a material consideration when assessing proportionality, and your view of that.
Yes, absolutely. I think so. When I speak about proportionality, obviously the degree of loss is relevant, but there's no question that the economic well-being of the country is a legitimate aim. As to whether measures are proportionate to achieving that aim, considering whether there is any reasonable suspicion is one thing, and also considering the degree of external oversight is another. And so that is something that this bill does include. There are various ways in which some of the powers are subject to independent review, for example. We do have some suggestions as to how those independent review mechanisms can be a stronger safeguard and therefore make the measures more proportionate. For example, the independent review mechanisms seem to have the ability to access information, but no power to demand information. So there is a query as to the transparency, the full ability of the independent reviewer in different circumstances to meet their objectives. I think there also might be a requirement that might be of assistance when an independent reviewer does lay their report to Parliament with recommendations. If those recommendations aren't going to be adopted, perhaps an obligation for the department to provide reasons why not would be a more transparent way of ensuring that accountability, that oversight measure is effective as intended.
Sally Jameson.
Minister Weston, but clearly there's a lot of nervousness from yourself around looking into people's finances in order to detect fraud and error. I suppose my question is, from your perspective, what would be the alternative? Because the country can't afford to lose another 35 billion, and so we need to find a way to make sure that doesn't happen. And given the level of nervousness you've shown, what would be your suggestion that we would do instead?
Yeah, I think just on the 35 billion point, I don't think that's. I think the benefit fraud and error figure was, my understanding was around 10 billion, and I think 7 billion can be shown to be fraud. But then I think it's also really important to I'm sorry if I've got that wrong.
I think that was since the pandemic. The overall figure's 35 billion.
Oh, thank you.
The 9.7 is last year's.
I'm grateful. It's a difficult one because for example, we could have almost zero crime in this country if everyone's houses were installed with 24/7 surveillance. There will always be a way of decreasing privacy to increase state surveillance and therefore a reduction of unwanted behaviour, but the balance needs to be struck. Justice's view is that the balance is struck when the state is getting new powers to investigate into people's private affairs. The balance is struck with that reasonable suspicion, reasonable grounds for believing, reasonable suspicion threshold, because that ensures that the powers that the state is being given in any primary legislation aren't open to abuse and aren't open to arbitrariness. Because, of course, the laws that are on the statute book must be written narrowly so they protect rights on the face of it, rather than being written broadly and relying on the self-restraint of future administrations to exercise them proportionately.
Thank you. The information. Thank you, Chair. The Information Commissioner has indicated that some of the areas that their previous concerns on the Data Protection and Digital Information Bill have now been answered. Do you not share that position, and you are continue to have concerns in that area?
Continue to have concerns, acknowledging that there are two key oversight mechanisms in the bill that weren't in the previous one. So this independent reviewer role, and of course there is the code of practice. I think it would be far easier for Justice, but more importantly for Parliament, to be assured of the proportionality of any human rights infringement if that code of practice were before them. The Human Rights Memorandum to this bill actually, at paragraph 79, does note that whether the EVM measures are proportionate and do prevent arbitrary interference with people's privacy, the code of practice will significantly impact that. So in order for Parliament to be confident, I think that the content of that code of practice and the way in which these powers are actually going to be used, it would be very helpful to see that detail.
Thank you.
Thank you. And staying on the AI framework, you've spoken obviously about the changes being made in the data protection bill, but other than the undertakings given by ministers, what other legal restrictions would there be on the operation of artificial intelligence in decision-making and investigation under this bill?
Under this bill, the wider legislative framework that operates with respect to artificial intelligence in general, I will try and give a very brief summary. There's, of course, human rights obligations, which are on any public authority or any authority exercising public functions. Equality obligations as well against direct and indirect discrimination. There's the data protection framework as well, which relates to personal data. And then there's probably within different sectoral areas of artificial intelligence use, there's different obligations there.
And what recourse would individuals have who are adversely affected, whether it's by a machine-made decision-making or even human decision-making? What recourse would individuals have?
That's where it gets quite tricky, because, of course, the first barrier would be even knowing that you've been subject to any kind of algorithmic decision-making, or algorithmic assisted decision-making. If you've been subject to a completely automated decision, then the new data bill that's coming through would enable you to make representations and to request human intervention after the fact. But if it's algorithms that are assisting a human decision-making process, then there's no right to be notified, let alone to complain. And I think that also the position of someone who has been subject to one of these decision-making processes also just needs to be considered in a very realistic situation, which is the motivation and empowerment and means and brain space to complain in those kind of circumstances cannot always be relied on. And actually, justice is clear that whilst access to redress is always important, preventing unfair decision-making is of course, and preventing discriminatory decision-making always needs to, of course, be the priority.
Thank you very much.
There being no further questions, shall I thank the witness for her evidence, and we will now move on to the next panel. We'll now hear evidence from Mark Cheeseman, OBE, Chief Executive of the Public Sector Fraud Authority, and we have until 10 minutes till 4 o'clock. Mike Wood.
Thank you. And going back to a question I asked of Mr. Smart earlier, obviously one of the main measures in the bill is the move of the PSFA from the Cabinet Office to an independent body. How do you see the practical benefits, particularly obviously how do the public or the public sector going to benefit from that new status?
So I think the practical benefits to consider are where these powers are being operated from having some degree of independence from ministers and separation, and that's a practice you'd see in other circumstances as well, so it may give Parliament some assurance there. That then is balanced up against the cost of such a thing too.
And then that independence is obviously balanced with many of the provisions in the bill, particularly around the information notices and the other, if you like, Cabinet Office parts of the bill, really come down to decision making by the Minister for the Cabinet Office. How does the independence of the PSFA then interrelate with the personal sign-offs required by a specific minister?
So in the bill, the Minister passes the powers to authorised officers, and the authorised officers could then be in that statutory body, and the authorised officers would be the ones who use the powers to do that. And those authorised officers would be people who have experience in working fraud and are part of the government counter-fraud profession.
Do you think that the provisions in the bill, which are obviously fairly vague in terms of who can exercise those powers directly, and comparing that with the powers set out in other legislation that creates such investigatory powers, should we be a bit more specific as to what that experience or qualifications or seniority looks like?
So in the bill at the moment, it lays it to the authorised officers, and one of the transformations that's been going on in government is the professionalisation of counter-fraud work. So we now have a counter-fraud profession. There are professional standards, and there weren't a while back for a lot of investigators in the public sector, but there are professional standards and practices and a code of ethics for people who work in that. So I think that sets a standard of the knowledge, skills and experience that those authorised officers would have, who would then exercise the powers. As to the level they are, I mean, that aligns to, again, current practice and what you would see across the public sector.
Is there a reason why it's not possible to refer within the legislation to those standards, if that's the accepted norm?
I'm not sure whether one would refer to it in the legislation. It could be in the code of practice and aspects like that.
How close do you feel we are to being able to have at least an idea of what a code of practice would look like based on the PSFA's own experience, obviously in its current form?
So the Public Sector Fraud Authority has been created been created by bringing together people from other spaces. So these powers are designed from HMRC, Ministry of Revenue and Customs, we heard from Richard Lass earlier, and the powers that they use to take action on suspected fraud, where they have reasonable cause to do so. And it's some of those experts who have come and developed these powers. So I feel that actually that capability will come into the organisation, and the organisation will be able to use that to use the powers.
But I mean, obviously, for those of us who've been asked to make a decision as to whether the powers within the legislation that's put before us, whether those powers are reasonable and proportionate, as we've heard from one witness after another today, it is very difficult for us to make those decisions without knowing how they will be carried out in practice, and that obviously means knowing what will be in such a code.
Absolutely, and the code of practice will be developed alongside the legislation, as is standard practice.
But obviously, when we saw this in other legislation under the previous government, it's not uncommon for ministers to give undertaking that at least a draft code might be published before legislation returns to Parliament, final decisions to be made. I know this is perhaps one to ask in a later session of ministers, but in terms of developing a draft code that parliamentarians might be able to look at whilst making those decisions, given that the legislation is obviously now well underway, is that something that you feel would be a long way away, that it may be at least possible to have an outline of a draft code in a reasonably short period of time, accepting that there will obviously be developments with experience as we learn?
Of course. So, I'll leave ministers to answer that question later. But we are developing the codes of practice now. And the reason I talked about who's come into the Public Sector Fraud Authority to think about this is because it's not from scratch. We are basing it off practice that goes on elsewhere now. So we are currently developing those, and they're underway. But I'll leave it for ministers to say the timescale.
And in terms of the obligations on organisations who are issued with particularly information notices, based on your current experience, how many of the organisations that you approach asking for information typically respond within 10 days?
So I think it's important to remember that the 10 days in the legislation is a minimum. So that's the lowest that would be used. It's not saying it would always be 10 days. And one of the witnesses earlier highlighted that actually some organisations will have standard practices where they could respond that. They'll be set up to respond in it. And the time that's given will be dependent on the organisation you're interacting with, the individual you're interacting with, and what's reasonable. And what our fraud investigators are trying to do is they're trying to balance the expediency of doing the investigation with making sure people can respond, and that's a fair and reasonable time to respond. So I think the balance is there, and we should remember that timescale is a minimum.
It's absolutely a minimum, but I think discretion to vary from that minimum is at the discretion of the minister. Is that correct?
Yes, at the discretion, yes, yeah.
And
legislation.
A review of the minister's decision also then goes back to the original decision maker.
So slightly different, goes back within the structure, but the review of that decision is done by a separate authorised officer to the original minister. To the original authorised officer who did it.
So in terms of, it's certainly a minimum, but a decision as to whether that is the right period of time is very much within the organisation that is asking for the information, rather than there being any formal and independent process for the person responding to that request to be able to say, actually, we just can't do this.
So the process, as in the legislation now, is within the organisation, but there is an extra safeguard of the independent chair, which will be reviewing the decisions taken by authorised officers on a sampling basis, one would expect, but we're reviewing those decisions. So if there are practices that happen where those timescales look unreasonable, the independent chair can pick up on that and ask for action to be taken on it.
But I'm right in saying that will be at a systemic level rather than a case by case, being able to say that was the wrong decision and I'm changing that decision.
It would be there will be case by case review, but you're right. It would be more here is an issue that should be dealt with in how.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I suspect Minister Gould will have the bulk of questions for you, Mark, but if I could just ask a very general question. There's been, understandably, a lot of discussion and questions today around the balance between people's privacy and the need to prevent fraud. What is your overall view on whether the bill strikes the necessary balance between the two?
My view is that the bill does strike that balance. It tries to strike the balance, and it's difficult because what you need to balance is the ability to take action on someone who has committed fraud against the state with making sure you have fair and reasonable processes where someone hasn't, but you're looking at them. And the purpose of an investigation is not to find fraud, it is to find fact. And that, again, is why we have a profession who are trained and have a code of ethics around objectivity, because that's their role, to find fact, not to find fraud. So I think the bill tries to strike that, both by having authorised officers and by having the oversight that's in place. A part of the government structure in having the counter-fraud profession provides some of that as well. So my view of this bill compared to others is that there is a fair amount of independent oversight. I think that is a good thing to increase how well things are done.
Mr. Payne. Michael Payne.
Mr. Cheeseman for being with us today. The National Audit Office put the amount of fraud and error outside the tax and benefit system at between 5 billion and 30 billion in 2023-24 alone. I just wondered what your own and PSFA's assessment is of the quantum of fraud against the public sector, whether you could share a bit more about that with the committee.
Of course. So when we estimate fraud and error, as the NAO have done. And the NAO have used the methodology we've used previously. We haven't repeated that yet because they've gone ahead of the cycle of us. I have no reason currently to indicate that their estimate is incorrect, but obviously it's their estimate. Joshua was here earlier for that. I think it's fair to say, so we estimate fraud and error as a whole rather than separately fraud. But what we've seen with the fraud data is detected fraud in the public sector has risen over the past few years. We published that, some of that due to COVID, but some of that also in other spaces. We've also heard from witnesses earlier who have indicated that the threat has risen, and there are some changes in perception on fraud and how many people may approach it. So my perspective on that is that the level of fraud and error in the system is high. There is waste there. Parliament itself has challenged government on the more it can do to deal with that. The threat is growing and is rising, and therefore, from my position, I think the powers will be helpful to take action on that. So therefore, there is more to do to drive down waste and reduce fraud in the system.
Thank you. Just one more, if I may, Mr. Chairman. There have been questions throughout the previous sessions about concerns over training for the enforcement officers in the PSFA. I just wondered if you wanted to say anything further to what you've already said to the committee about training for the enforcement officers.
So I would come back to, as I've said, the counter-fraud profession. We are one of the only countries in the world with standards, professional standards published. Those are used by the police. They are used by the Serious Fraud Office, and they're used by HMRC, who we heard from earlier, who use these types of powers successfully on a regular basis. And we would have exactly the same standard of an investigator, both by bringing them in, but also by training them up to those standards, who would use these powers if and when they're in place.
Thank you.
Georgia Gould.
Very much. My question just wanted to build off the line of questioning earlier about kind of ministers' sign-off. So my understanding, and I think it'd be really helpful to clarify this, is that the powers would be delegated to authorised officers and there would be no ministerial sign-off in any part of the investigation, and that would rightly be separate. And I think it'd be really helpful if you could clarify how that would work in practice.
Yes, apologies, that was a slip of my head when I said that earlier. So yes, the powers from the minister, it's written as the minister in the legislation, is delegated to authorised officers who would sit in the PSFA. They would be qualified and known with the standard of the profession. They would be taking the decision. And any review decisions, what I was referring to earlier, any review decisions would be taken by a separate authorised officer if someone was asking for a review, in the number of reviews that are in the legislation that enable people who are in the process to ask for an information gathering request or something else to be reviewed.
And those authorised officers would make the decision about the timing to allow for information gathering. That wouldn't be a
absolutely. That decision is made by the authorised officers based on their experience of weighing up both proportionality and how they can engage with the organisation or individual they are asking for that information. And that individual or organisation can request a review of that request.
Thank you. And it would be helpful to kind of hear from you the work more broadly that PSFA have been doing to consult and to talk to other parts of the public sector and other experts in developing this package and the thinking behind it.
Yes, absolutely. So, I mean, firstly, the PSFA has been brought together from experts from across the system, and we've brought in experts not just within the public sector, but also from other sectors as well. We also work with other countries to try and understand what they do on So we have been consulting very widely with the public sector, and a number of the people who have come to look at this have looked at it from the point of view of what they could not achieve in their own public bodies, and therefore how they could take more action and what that power would look like. We've also brought together other investigators and asked them what they think the optimal powers are, what they think the proportionality aspect should be and the safeguards should be, and considered that. So we've done quite broad consultation within the public sector, but also we've asked local authorities what their views are on other aspects like that.
And that there were some concerns raised earlier that the PSFA would take their eye off the ball on prevention and the wider area of work, and only become an agency focused on enforcement. So it would be helpful for you to address and answer those concerns.
Yeah, absolutely. So the Public Sector Fraud Authority has two elements to it. One is overseeing government and how individual departments are doing in dealing with fraud and what they're doing on it. And the bill itself says that departments would refer cases to the PSFA and ask them to be dealt with under it. The second is providing some of the services that support departments. And there are services, this is around the taking action on fraud where it happens. But the biggest difference we will make alongside that is through prevention. And we've heard from witnesses earlier about the use of data and analytics. We have a data and analytics service which works with public bodies to use data and analytics to find and prevent fraud up front. We also have a risk service which works with other parts of the public sector to understand the risks they are facing, to then again prevent those risks by putting in controls. So there will always be that balance, but whilst there will always be that balance, there will also always be some element of fraud that is still committed. We won't be able to design a system where there is no fraud risk. Design out fraud. So there will always be cause for an efficient and effective and proportionate part of the machine to take action on those instances of fraud and to investigate them thoroughly and properly.
Rebecca Smith.
Slightly nuanced question, but there's been a lot of talk about the kind of authorised officer role. And to my mind, when you go from sort of the minister to the authorised officer, it feels like quite a big jump in terms of title. So it might be quite a small thing, but from your experience at the PSFA, does that terminology work if we're then looking to expand it beyond that in terms of people's understanding of how senior the people are doing these investigations? Because to me, an authorised officer could be somebody, the word officer is often used in, particularly in social, in public sector, to be quite a junior role. So to me, how do we make sure that people actually understand across the public as well as across the public sector how senior these people are? And does that need to be on the face of the bill? Is that included in the code of practice? How would you look at that?
No, absolutely. So again, I don't know that it would need to be on the bill, but that would be for you to debate. As it gets past the authorised officer, there is a structure there. There are senior leaders with deep experience in investigating fraud who are overseeing them. We have structures of senior investigation officers overseeing your investigators and the individual authorised officers. So while it may feel like a big jump, it's not. There is a structure that goes through to ensure quality, to ensure the right practices, so on and so forth. That directly compares to what happens elsewhere, basically. So it'd be pretty comfortable that authorised officers is a term used elsewhere. I recognise what you say about the seniority of grade. I had to have a wry smile because it took me a while to get to HEO and SEO. Sorry, higher. And so, but those are senior, experienced roles, experienced administrators with a high level of skill set and expertise doing those roles. And actually, part of the reason for creating the counter-fraud profession is to show the expertise, the capability that those experienced counter-fraud experts have in taking action on fraud.
Okay, thank you.
There being no further questions, I thank the witness for his evidence and we'll move on to the next panel, please. Which one is it? Who's asking this one? Big Brother. We'll now hear oral evidence from Jasleen Chaggar, Legal and Policy Officer at Big Brother Watch. We have until 10 minutes past 4 o'clock. Mike Wood. Oh, sorry. Rebecca Smith.
Obviously, we know that this bill is sort of a move on from the bill that was started under the last government, so the Data Protection and Digital Information Bill, as far as I'm aware. Is that the right way around? Yeah. And I know that there were some concerns that the Information Commissioner had in the previous iteration. So are you similar? And they've said that those concerns have roughly been addressed within this new bill. So are you similarly reassured, or do you still have outstanding concerns about this piece of legislation?
We recognise that this bill is different from the previous Conservative government's bill. There are some changes that have been made. We're still concerned that what are purported to be safeguards in this bill are really insufficient. One of the major safeguards that's sort of pointed to as a reassurance is the fact that financial transaction information and special category data won't be handed over to DWP from the banks. But it's sort of a circular safeguard in reality, because once the account number and name of the individual has been passed on to the DWP, they can very easily go back to the bank and request that granular financial information, which is incredibly privacy invasive, as you'll know. And so we're still concerned with the safeguards in the bill. Another similar safeguard is the provision to have an independent person, but there are no safeguards about what qualifications that person should have. They're expected to provide an annual report to Parliament, but we're concerned that that sort of role of oversight is more to do with enforcement than accountability, because I think there are provisions about the efficiency of the measures, but no provisions about how they impact equality or the adverse consequences on benefits recipients. So we're not reassured by these safeguards.
Can I come back on that? In particular, then, what would get you to a place of feeling more comfortable in terms of what those safeguards could look like? Is there something that there's almost you can use it once, then you can't use the data again? What might that look like? Is that where would you need to see movement to get to a place where you were comfortable with the safeguards?
Is that in relation to the...
Particularly in relation, I think, to using the data, as you just gave an example of bank account details and information and spending and that sort of thing.
So on the eligibility verification, what we're calling the bank spying powers, we are recommending that they be removed in their entirety, because these really are unprecedented financial surveillance powers. There are no other laws like this in this country, and they would permit generalised mass surveillance of everybody's bank account. It's not just benefits claimants will be targeted, it's everyone's account, yours and I, will be scanned using algorithmic software to make sure that these eligibility indicators are not met. And also, even if you are a benefits recipient, you can appoint an individual, a parent, a guardian, an appointed person, or your landlord to receive benefit on your behalf. And so these people will also be pulled into the net of surveillance. And so we don't really see a way in which these measures could ever be proportionate.
Okay, thank you.
Minister?
Thank you, and thank you for joining us. A couple of initial questions, and I think you've kind of neatly set out your position, which is that there is no circumstance under which you would support the eligibility verification measure. But I was interested when you said there are no other laws like this in the country. We've heard from HMRC today about their ability to receive bulk data with regard to every interest-bearing bank account in the country, and they do that on a regular basis. How do you consider this power to be different to that one?
What's really important about this bill is the conflation between fraud and error. And so it's not just people who are suspected of serious crime or even low-level crime who are pulled into this net of surveillance. It's also people who have maybe whilst navigating the complexities of the benefit system, have found themselves on the wrong side of applying for a benefits claim and made a mistake. And it also involves DWP's own errors, which make up 1 in 10 of the errors. And so what's really critical when we're thinking about this bill is that it's suspicionless surveillance that applies to everyone.
Can I just clarify, though, because we have heard testimony from HMRC today that they receive bulk data on every interest-bearing account in the country, not only where there is suspicion. So how do you perceive this, which you've described as unprecedented, as distinct from those powers?
There is another difference between HMRC recovering money and DWP recovering money. When you think about the types of individuals these powers we're recovering money from, they are among some of the most vulnerable in our society. There are people living on the breadline. There are disabled people, elderly people, carers, who will all be dragged into this surveillance. And the risk of errors that are caused by the automated system that is proposed will therefore have a disproportionate effect on those groups of people. And so there is a difference, I think, if that's the case, between them being used by the HMRC and DWP.
So to clarify, you accept that there are bulk data powers, it's just a different cohort of people?
I am not aware of those powers that are similar to eligibility verification notices that are exercised by DWP. I'm aware that they have similar powers in relation to direct deduction orders, and maybe that's the distinction that the HMRC will make, the witnesses earlier were making.
I mean, it wasn't, but we'll leave it there because clearly you're not aware of the powers that I'm referring to. Could I just ask whether, when you talk about the inclusion of error as well as fraud in what we are attempting to do here, you accept that there is the potential through the effective use of the eligibility verification measure to detect overpayments through error sooner, thereby reducing any overpayment that somebody could have because it would come to light earlier?
Yeah, and that's an incredibly laudable aim to stop people getting into debt. But the question is, are we willing to infringe the privacy rights of the entirety of the population to do that? Perhaps a more proportionate solution would be to make it easier for those benefits claimants who are making mistakes to navigate the system in the first place. And just to come back to your previous point, if you would be happy to send me any information about those powers, I'd be happy to get back to you with our position on those.
Okay, thank you. And then just a final question with regard to an assertion that you made towards the beginning of your contribution. You said that once that the power was the eligibility verification measure, if I understood what you said, was circular because if a flag was placed on an account, we could then just request the bank account statements. So just to clarify, do you accept that we are only able to utilise our information gathering powers where there is a suspicion of fraud, and therefore it isn't a mass power to do that? It would only be where we have that information that suggested that we would need to follow up on that because of a specific concern that had come to light?
I accept that the government is purporting that this is a sufficient safeguard, but I propose that it isn't because of that circularity, yeah. Okay.
So I suppose there's just one further question, really, which is in terms of the role that you would ever perceive for banks and financial institutions in tackling fraud in the social security system, could you ever countenance a scenario where that would be of value and worthwhile?
Absolutely. We believe as much as anyone that fraud and error needs to be tackled in this country. But our position is that the best way to do that is through intelligence-led policing, where there is suspicion of fraud and not just of error, that is well-resourced. And in relation to error, like I've said, we think that making the benefits system easier to navigate in the first place and the DWP getting its own house in order to avoid its own errors are far better, more proportionate and privacy-preserving solutions than the ones proposed in this bill.
So given that we have no way of knowing if somebody is in breach of the capital limit once they've given their word that that's not the case, how would you suggest, where there is no suspicion of fraud because we do not know what somebody has in their bank account, we detect that particular form of fraud?
I think that it's important that suspicion has already arisen before those policing powers can be enacted. Police already have powers to go and request that granular financial information where there is suspicion of fraud.
So what I'm saying is that there wouldn't be suspicion because we have absolutely no way of knowing. So is it the position that you're taking today that we should not attempt to address this because there can never be a suspicion of what somebody has in their bank account without looking for it?
I think that there are ways to address this. We are a civil liberties organisation and our job is to be a watchdog to ensure that privacy rights are preserved. I don't have the solution for how the police should find out whether someone is suspicious or not. But to sacrifice the privacy rights of all of us where no suspicion even exists, just to find out if we should be suspicious of someone, like I said, is a disproportionate power.
Sarah Berry.
Thank you very much.
And thank you for coming along. I think we should ask you the same general questions as we've asked all the other witnesses that we've had today. So can you tell us, do you believe that this bill in its entirety is a proportionate way of dealing with fraud and error in the DWP? Is that one part of the bill only? I think that has been sort of put to you, but just to be clear. And I think given the position that the ICO has more or less laid out of their reassurance depending on seeing the code of conduct, and I think we've come to that conclusion through a number of guests today, would a sufficient code of conduct make you content with it, or is there something in the face of the bill that needs to particularly go?
Our view is that these powers will only ever be proportionate if they uphold the presumption of innocence, due process and judicial oversight, and that any privacy infringements are set out in law and are necessary and proportionate. A code of conduct, we feel, would be insufficient because it would just defer those legal protections to some other time. Also, if an individual has a problem through the use of these powers, then they're not able to enforce their rights through a code of conduct. Whereas if those protections were set out in legislation, then it's a far more rights-preserving framework that we would definitely feel more comfortable with.
Thank you very much. And do you have any more to say about what you think the unintended consequences of the bill might be?
We're really concerned about the unintended consequences of this bill. We appreciate that there has been an effort to tackle fraud and error, which is a serious problem, but we have to also consider what the adverse consequences and unintended consequences will be. And one of those is the algorithmic error that can occur when automated systems are being used on a population level-wide scale. If these algorithms are scanning the bank accounts of 10 million people, if they have an error rate of just 1%, that's going to be 100,000 wrongful cases where people have been investigated where they're innocent. We're also really concerned about the sort of human backstop element of this. The DWP has assured us that there will be human involvement in any investigations on the back of receiving this data, but when you're receiving such a deluge of information from these banks, it throws into question whether this human involvement will be meaningful. And the impact assessment acknowledges this because it says that we might have to slow down the rate at which we're receiving all this data from banks. So we're very concerned about the false positives, and we're also concerned about the devastating effects this would have on the lives of individuals who are then wrongfully investigated. When it's being applied in the context of benefits recipients who are already subjected to burdensome documentation requirements, and then they have to, then they find themselves subjected to investigation by DWP. We've heard from dozens of disability rights and elderly rights groups about the anxiety and stress this is going to cause. And also, when benefits recipients are under investigation, they can then also find that their benefits are suspended, which means that they won't have money to pay for food and their medical bills and their heating bills. So there's also the equality impact that has to be considered, and we haven't actually seen an equality impact assessment for this bill either, which is a concern.
Thank you.
Thank you.
There being no further questions, I thank the witness for her evidence, and we'll move on to the next panel.
Thank you for having me.
Ooh, now which one of you is it? Right. Right. Gosh, how complicated.
Might be worth just checking the sounds and just asking.
Rick, can you hear me?
Yeah, there we go.
Yes.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Can you see inside the room and hear the voices as well?
I can see a sort of POV of the entire room.
Lovely.
And I have heard some voices, yes.
That's wonderful. Thank you.
Very good. Right, we'll now hear oral evidence from Geoff Fimister of the Campaign for Disability Justice and Rick Burgess from the Greater Manchester Disabled People's Panel. He joins us via video link. For this session, we have until 20 minutes till 5 o'clock. Could I ask the witness? No, I've introduced you already. So we'll go straight to Rebecca Smith.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, gentlemen, and hopefully I can look at both of you in the same eye if I look this way. We've heard quite a lot already this afternoon about concerns around the disproportionate potential impact on disabled people. It would be really good to hear from you yourselves as disability campaigners, because we've heard it on your behalf so far. What you think, how you think the measures will affect disabled people, and what you think could be done to address the impact that may be had as a result of the bill. I don't know if Rick wants to go first, and then I'll come to Geoff in the room.
Geoff.
Geoff, go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much. Yes, should say first of all, the Campaign for Disability Justice has relatively recently launched a few months ago by Inclusion Barnet, and we now have a substantial number of several hundred individual supporters and a substantial number of organisations supporting us, ranging from large charities to grassroots disabled people's organisations. So we get quite a lot of feedback. I suppose our concern with this particular bill has a broad aspect and also a very specific aspect as to how it may impact on disabled people. I suppose the broad aspect is that because by definition it's focusing very much on means tested benefits, therefore it will disproportionately affect people on low incomes by definition, and disproportionately affect disabled people because disabled people are more likely to be on low incomes than others. The practical issue that I think has really attracted most concern in the conversations that I've had is basically this issue of the previous witness mentioned of false positives, which is we're all familiar, I think, with a world in which we have problems with malfunctioning technology. Every few months my internet provider locks my inbox because of suspicious activities, which have included sending an email to an MP's researcher, sending an email to MENCAP on one occasion. Every now and then my bank freezes my wife and my bank accounts because of suspicious activities such as purchasing a sandwich from Marks and Spencer's in Deptford on one occasion. I mean, that might sound entertaining, but it's a serious business that this tech goes wrong. And I think the previous witness made the point that if you have very large numbers of people embraced in this kind of trawl, therefore there will be a percentage where it will go wrong. Now, we don't know whether it will be a large percentage or a small percentage, but even a small percentage of a big number is a loss of people. And people being left without any income if the technology triggers the cessation of their benefit is a serious business. Not having any income can cause hardship, death and loss of stress, and in extreme cases there can be serious health and safety issues. So I think disabled people are concerned about that kind of eventuality. Now, as to what we can do about this, I understand the thrust of the bill and where it's coming from, and it has, in parliamentary terms, widespread backing as well as a number of reservations, I think. But what I think we would like to see is some sort of safeguard whereby benefit could not be stopped unless and until it had been established that there was an underpayment. Not that the DWP thinks there might have been because the tech spotted something. So the sort of shoot first and ask questions later approach is something we don't want to see, and if we could have some kind of protection along those lines, I think that would be helpful.
Rick?
Should just stress that I'm from the Greater Manchester Coalition of Disabled People. The panel is something we do, but I'm not speaking in that role today. Particular worries about how this affects people with living with mental distress. So particularly if you have diagnoses in the sort of areas of paranoia, schizophrenia, depression or anxiety, this adds to the feeling of being monitored, of being followed, of being surveilled, because you quite literally are being surveilled by your bank on behalf of the government. So it will necessarily reduce the well-being of disabled people who are claiming benefits that are being monitored by this system. There's really no getting away from that. In terms of the potential risks, is when you enter into a trawling operation, you're not targeting it in any way. You are simply looking at everybody. So the error rate becomes extremely important in that. So we don't know what exactly the technology is. We haven't seen a quality impact assessment. But even if it had a failure rate of 0.1%, which would be a quite respectable systemic failure rate, 0.1% is pretty acceptable in a lot of these areas. That's still 1,000 people per million scanned. And if you're talking about even the means tested benefits, that's going to run to thousands of people getting false positives. If you think about the entire DWP caseload, which is 22.6 million people, so that is over 22,000 people. And if we, bear in mind the post office scandal is less than 1,000 people, you are at the inception stage of something which could be the greatest miscarriage of justice in British history if you go ahead with this untested technology that has not had properly impact assessments. To stress, though, we are against this measure in totality because it does treat disabled people as a separate population who should have lower rights to privacy than the general population. And in that respect, given the United Nations has condemned the UK twice in a row for grave and systemic human rights abuses, this is further going in the wrong direction and failing to address those failures identified by the United Nations, and is now further marking disabled people for additional state oppression and surveillance, which, as I said, will necessarily be harmful to a great many of those people under this surveillance regime.
Minister?
Thank you. Could I just come back on the last point that you made there, Rick, around the suggestion that this treats disabled people as a distinct part of the population under different rules and measures. So the The bill is targeting the three benefits that have the highest levels of fraud and error at present, so universal credit, pension credit and employment support allowance. So I would accept that there's a higher prevalence of people who are disabled in those cohorts, but it's not restricted exclusively to disabled people. So I just wondered if you could elaborate a little bit on how you feel that disabled people in isolation would be being treated as a separate entity.
Because we're overrepresented in those classes, if you choose to target it at those cohorts, you are accepting an additional level of targeting towards disabled people, which is discriminatory.
I mean, I would argue that we were accepting a different level of expectations upon, or checking in this case on the eligibility verification measure of everybody in receipt of those benefits. So I would be perfectly happy to accept that there may be some indirect discrimination against disabled people by virtue of the fact that they are overrepresented in the cohort. But are you suggesting that this would amount to direct discrimination?
I think it does edge into that, and I think there's certainly established thinking and case law that begins to establish that. And I think, the Equality Human Rights Commission need to be brought into this urgently. There needs to be public and transparent equality impact assessments, because I don't see how this does not breach a right to privacy and a discrimination against groups who are overrepresented in these cohorts.
And so just to test that a little further, were we to do anything in the prevent space on fraud and error that sought to increase the safeguards and checks that are made for all benefit claimants, is it your view that all of those would directly discriminate against disabled people because they are overrepresented in the cohort?
It is where that measure is one of additional enforcement of measures or rules or laws that would have negative consequences. So, and the key of this is it goes to the trawling nature of the technology. It is not targeted beyond, everyone on UC, everyone on ESA, everyone forgotten, the other. When you trawl, you do not target, and then you've got a huge cohort, and if that cohort, you've got an overrepresentation, without even thinking about it, you have then enacted a level of discrimination because of the trawling nature of this approach. If it applied to everybody on benefits, that's also slightly questionable because you're applying a different level of privacy to people who get an award from the DWP versus people who don't. If it was applied to the whole country, then I suppose that would be fairer in one respect, but also it would be a breach of everyone's privacy, which also goes to another question. If this is such a important measure for government revenue, by amounts, the amount lost to the tax gap is 4 times what is quoted, in fact more than 4 times. So it is, I think, 9.1 billion. The tax gap is close to over 39 billion. You would actually be recovering more money if you subjected the whole country to it, but I would suggest that the reason you don't subject the whole country to it is because there would be outrage, because people would find their rights to privacy have been completely abused. And so applying it in these targeted ways also suggests a level of, well, these are people who perhaps have less rights to privacy than the general population. I mean, if you're happy to have your bank account monitored in this way, fine. But you've not suggested that this should apply to the general population. You suggested it should apply to a population who are receiving benefits, and within that population there is an overrepresentation of disabled people who are already exhaustively monitored, reviewed, tested, having to provide proof, whether it's for a blue badge, for PIP, for ESA, for universal credit, for a concessionary pass on public transport. I mean, the life of a disabled person is to be constantly tested, examined, having to produce proof. And this is another step in that, and that's why it is germane to the United Nations report on the Convention of the Rights of Disabled People, because we've continued to go down a road that is removing rights and not respecting them and subjecting disabled people to greater scrutiny, greater surveillance and greater tests of their basic rights to be a citizen of this country. And it's really quite distressing for disabled people to be in this position that not only are we, had 2 really damning reports from the United Nations, but a new government is actually adopting old policies of the previous government and continuing on that road. It's really, I have to tell you that the level of anger and distress in the disabled community is absolutely enormous, and it's really difficult to explain to people that this does not appear to be quite an obvious attack or motivated by ableist assumptions about how disabled people run their lives, or whether they're more or less honest, or whether they're more or less genuine than people who are not disabled. It's really, really hard going for us. I have to tell you that. Disabled people in Britain have had a decade and a half of being the scapegoat of this country. And it has to stop. And this measure is actually making it worse as opposed to stopping that scapegoating.
Mr. Fimister, you...
Thank you. Yes, I just wanted to add to something point that Rick made. I mean, we both made the point that the discriminatory aspect in relation to disabled people arises in the immediate sense from the fact that these are means-tested benefits that are primarily in scope at the moment, and disabled people are disproportionately likely to be on low incomes. I think it's worth adding that if this measure was to be extended at some future stage to a wider range of benefits, so as to potentially bring specifically disability benefits into scope, that would be obviously even more sharp discrimination against disabled people. And these are not theoretical points that Rick's just been making. There is a really raw feeling amongst disabled people that they are being targeted. And in the context at the moment of quite a lot of negative media publicity around the interface between employment and unemployment amongst disabled people, it is an unpleasant atmosphere for disabled people, and certainly that's the feedback that we're getting.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, I won't ask any more questions, but if I may, Desmond, just say to Rick that I think it might be helpful for a follow-up conversation to take place without wishing to get into a protracted argument. I do think there were some things there that I don't recognise as part of the bill, but clearly if that is how people are feeling and the people that you represent are feeling, I'm very happy to ask officials to pick up a conversation to go through the detail there. Thank you.
Are there any further questions? There being no further questions, I thank the panel for their evidence, robustly delivered, and we'll move on to the next panel. So for the final session, we have the ministers in charge of the bill, and we have until 5 o'clock. You've been participating actively in the proceedings already. Could I ask both of you to please introduce yourselves for the record?
Andrew Weston, Minister for Transformation at the DWP.
Georgia Gould, Minister for Public Sector Reform at the Cabinet Office and with responsibility for fraud against the public sector.
Thank you. Mike Wood.
Thank you, Sir Geoff. And obviously a lot of the questions to witnesses today have revolved around the Code of Conduct. There are several references, in fact several sections of the bill that refer to Code or Codes of Conduct. Can you give us an idea of how they will operate? Are we looking at a single code or multiple documents? What will their status be?
So for the DWP part of the bill, there will be 3 individual codes of practice, one for the eligibility verification measure, one for the debt recovery measure, and one for the information gathering measure. In terms of exactly how they will work, you will appreciate that we are only able to talk in general terms at the moment, because that will depend what the final version of the bill looks like. That's why we don't currently have a code of practice that we can share. Perhaps it's helpful if I say a little bit about how we intend to engage both houses on the content of the codes of practice. So for the bill committee, I will provide an outline of the of what will be covered by the draft codes of practice as we come to each of the relevant clauses, allowing the committee to provide feedback on what they feel should be in there. Beyond that, we do intend, and there's ongoing engagements, as you've heard from, for instance, UK Finance earlier, we do intend to publish a draft version of the codes of practice as they pertain to the DWP in time for the House of Lords Committee stage, so they will also have the opportunity to play into the conversation on that before ultimately there will be a final statutory public consultation on the content of the codes of practice. So it's difficult to say with any sort of exactness what the codes of practice will look like at this stage, because without knowing what amendments, if any, will be made to the bill, it's difficult to say with precision what the codes of practice will look like. But I know, Georgia, you've got a code of practice on your side as well, haven't you?
I do, and the same applies. I will kind of, as we go through the different clauses, share with the committee where we are on the codes of practice in relation to those clauses, and we're working on the same timeline that Minister Weston set out. For the PSFA, within the bill, it requires a code of practice which is particularly focused on penalties in clause 60, but beyond this mandatory content, the intention is that the code of practice will also include information on safeguards, vulnerability assessments when it applies to the PSFA powers investigating individuals, and more detailed information on the various reviews and appeals.
Yeah. Andrew, obviously you've just come out of a period in opposition. You will understand the difficulty that this puts on members of the committee for being asked to consider legislation, fundamental aspects of which will depend on details in the Code of Conduct that you seem to be suggesting we won't see until the House of Commons has completed all of its stages.
I mean, that is the route that we are taking. Obviously, members have an opportunity to suggest what they would like to see in the code. The code is primarily an operational document rather than one on the general principles within the bill and how things what we're trying to achieve through it. But I absolutely understand that members will want to will want to see that. But we're simply not able to bring forward a final code of practice. It wouldn't be possible to do that without knowing what's in the bill. So we can commit to sharing a draft as soon as we are able, but even that would be subject to change. It's not unusual, as I understand it, for this to be the case.
So you say you can't bring forward the code at this point because the bill may change depending on amendments, and yet you're able to bring forward a draft code ahead of the House of Lords committee stage, where presumably you'll have rather less control over what amendments are actually passed. Surely that argument, if it was going to hold at all, would apply even more strongly to the House of Lords stages than to the House of Commons.
I mean, all I would say to you is that is the timeline that we are proposing to follow. We will share the draft code of practice as soon as we're able to do so for all of the measures that have them.
And what role will Parliament have in scrutinising those codes of conduct?
So the codes of practice will
codes of practice. Yes, right.
Will be laid before both houses. They will be published as the legislation sets out.
So they'll be published, but in terms of scrutiny, will there be any role for Parliament in agreeing or disregarding those codes?
I'm happy to confirm what precisely, because it may be that members, as we go through the committee stage, make it very clear what their expectations would be. But I will confirm for you before we go into line-by-line scrutiny on Thursday exactly what the current proposal is in that regard.
And why does the decision seem to have been taken to not introduce these as statutory instruments?
In terms of why the codes of practice have not been?
Yes.
Because they are documents that are iterative, that will change as we go through the test and learn phase. We're looking to introduce, particularly if I think about the eligibility verification measure, that in a sort of initially quite cautious manner, to check that it works, to check that we don't have the sort of overreach that some of the witnesses have suggested may be the case, to be certain that the false positives that we've talked about and witnesses have raised are minimised as best as possible. So it's to enable that flexibility that we have the maximum potential to make any changes that we require, but obviously we would update the House as and when we were to do that.
But Andrew, you'll be aware that new statutory instruments can be introduced and passed in Parliament in the space of 6 weeks, so it's not an obstacle to an iterative approach if you chose to have the code of practice through statutory instruments, as does happen in some areas, and take an approach that actually had a formal role for Parliament and the democratic scrutiny that obviously the government was so keen on when it was in opposition.
So I'd be very happy to have that conversation should you want to put down any amendments in that regard.
So, I mean, this is looking a lot like the kind of King Henry VIII powers that the government railed against in opposition for many years.
I mean, I wouldn't accept that. I don't think that is the case. What I would say is that, we do require that flexibility, even 6 weeks. If there are problems in the process, we would need to potentially act more swiftly than that based on feedback from stakeholders. But as I say, colleagues are very welcome to put down amendments if they want to secure any changes in that regard.
Say again?
Can I ask a procedural question to you? Is it possible to furnish committee members through the clerks with instances in the last Parliament where codes of practice were missing for legislation? I certainly sat on bill committees where we didn't even have the costings for government plans. I just wonder whether there seems to be a suggestion this isn't routine or is somehow abnormal. I wonder if we could have that.
And I think it's probably a question for the library.
Question for the library.
But let's carry on with the questioning.
Thanks, Geoff.
So if I may continue, and I am drawing to a conclusion. That obviously, the Cabinet Office has a document, Guide to Making Legislation. Are you aware of it?
Is that to me or to you as Cabinet Office?
Oh, well, no, both as ministers, obviously. It is the government's Guide to Making Legislation.
Yes.
And have you read it?
Not recently, but when I first became a minister, yes.
Okay, so obviously, in Annex E, which relates to codes of practice and legislation, the first paragraph of that annex says that where it is proposed to introduce a code of practice in a way or for a purpose which departs from the guidance below, ministers should be aware that this is likely to be controversial, particularly in the House of Lords. So have officials brought that to your attention?
So as I said earlier, we hope to have a draft code of practice by the time that we reach the House of Lords committee stage. But clearly, alongside consideration of that guidance, as I said, and then as was reiterated by Mr. Coyle, this has not been unusual practice in recent years, as I understand it.
But it then goes on to say that the drafting of the code ought to begin early enough to enable a decision as to whether statutory provision is required. Has that drafting been done early enough?
I would suggest that there is, as I said, I mean, we will debate these in more detail as we come to the relevant stages, but I think that we have done this in sufficient time to enable us to consult, as we are required to do on the statutory code of practice, and to ensure that both houses can see it as it makes its way through the process.
And then the following paragraph says that if Parliament is to be asked to enact statutory provisions relating to a code, which appears to be the case in this instance, a draft of the proposed code should, if at all possible, be made available so that the appropriateness of the statutory provisions can be properly considered. Obviously, that's as part of the legislative process. Shouldn't we have that information? Why should only the House of Lords be provided with that?
I mean, I suspect at that point you're asking a procedural question, so I'm not best placed to answer it.
Thank you,
Very good. Michelle Walsh.
Thank you, Chairman. My question is really quite straightforward. How much will this bill save the taxpayer in the welfare fraud space?
So in the DWP space, we estimate that over the forecast period it would be £1.5 billion. That roughly equates to around 950 million on the eligibility verification measure, with the overwhelming majority of the rest, in fact almost all of it, coming from the debt recovery power. But there are also significant savings potentially over time. Minister Gould may want to outline with regard to the PSFA powers. I realise they are scalable, so start off small scale, but I wonder if you want to comment on the potential there.
Yeah, they're more modest in the first instance, so we're estimating just under £60 million worth of savings, but it's we're kind of testing a new model, so if the model is successful, there's a potential to scale that up, and we think that this is the first time we're introducing powers to take on fraud in the wider public sector outside of tax and welfare, and there's a huge amount of fraud that has gone uninvestigated, so we think the kind of deterrent impact of this is going to be substantial.
Jill Sherman.
Thank you, Chair. We heard earlier from the Money and Pension Service and that Anna believes that the relationship between them and the DWP is really good, and she spoke about how Job Centre Plus advisors are now there's a link established to make sure that they're referred to for advice if needed to do with debts. So that kind of person-centred approach, I wondered how important you thought it was in the practical application of this bill, particularly in the case of error and the preventative measures that we've spoken about, so that there's a wrap-around care, if you like, so people don't get into problems with error much further down the line.
Absolutely, and as I highlighted in my questions to witnesses throughout the day, there is the potential through the eligibility verification measure for a number of overpayments to be detected more early than they would have been otherwise, thereby avoiding the sort of large numbers that we've seen people rack up in overpayments through, for instance, the carers allowance challenges that we have seen in recent years. The breadth of the conversation that we're looking to have with people who are in debt with the department is significant. So we heard about the Money Helper service that the Money Advice and Pension Service work with us on earlier. That's just one of a range of organisations and packages that we utilise to support people who are in debt. We know that that is, whatever the reason, whether it is fraud or error, but particularly, as you say, error, we know that that is an incredibly stressful time for people. What I would say as well is that the power is very much, in debt recovery terms, the power that we are taking is intended to be a power of last resort. What we always want to do, having been through all of the things that you would expect us to do around the vulnerability management framework that was referenced earlier and the assessment that we make of people's ability to pay, is to agree an affordable repayment plan. By the time that we reach the point at which we are looking for a direct deduction order, we would have looked to engage somebody on multiple occasions, contacted them several times, tried to agree that plan. This is really for people who we have no other means of engaging as much as a lever to try and bring them to the table and to have those sort of conversations that you reference as anything else, and also to address the fundamental unfairness that exists at the moment, which is that we are able to directly deduct from somebody who is in receipt of benefits by deducting from that benefit entitlement, and we're able to do the same for somebody who is in PAYE employment, but we do not have that opportunity for people who are in receipt of income through other means. That is most obviously self-employed people, but not exclusively. And I think there is a fundamental point there about addressing that inequity in the system, because having made those financial assessments, we know that these are people who can afford to pay. We have tried to reach out with the wraparound support that you suggested, and ultimately they continue to refuse to engage.
Michael Payne.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Obviously, been some discussions today about the use of technology and AI, so I just wondered what are you doing as ministers to ensure humans are still taking the final decisions on whether these powers should lead to enforcement?
So, as it relates to the DWP, and I don't know if you would want to say anything about the PSFA powers later, I think it's worth reflecting that the eligibility verification power that is proposed is effectively a data push power. The banks will not be making any decisions as to somebody's culpability or what the penalty somebody may receive would be, or whether indeed it is even a legitimate overpayment that they have flagged on an account. All they will do is send back a marker against an account that suggests that somebody is in breach of their eligibility requirements. So, for instance, that might include somebody who has more than £16,000 in their account and is in receipt of universal credit. It's really important to say that that flag is then passed to a human investigator to analyse that information and to look at what the reasons may be for that, because there can be very legitimate reasons why somebody has more than £16,000 in their account and is still entitled to benefits. So an example would be somebody who's received a compensation payment that is out of scope of what would be considered capital for benefit eligibility reasons. But in all of the 5 principal measures that we are taking on the DWP side of this bill, a human is involved in the decision making. So on eligibility verification, it's passed to an investigator. On information gathering, when we receive information, that is then passed to an investigator to consider the next steps in a fraud investigation. On debt recovery, it is an individual, a person, that would make a decision as to somebody's ability to repay a debt. On penalties reform as proposed, it would be a human that was determining whether somebody who received a penalty for fraud against the DWP grant scheme was what the actions would be to be taken against that person. That is entirely the way that it works now with any other penalty that they can already apply. And finally, on the powers of search and seizure, as you would expect, it will be a human judge who takes a decision on whether or not to issue a warrant. So at every stage, a human decision maker is baked in before any final decision is made about sanction or otherwise.
Rebecca Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm going to ask one question in a second, but I just wanted to come back on the point that that Mike Woods made about the code of practice and the fact that Minister Weston, you've said that each time we get to a point in the bill scrutiny that it might reflect or relate to a bit of the code of practice, that you will bring that to us at that point and we can discuss it. Is that going to be in writing? Because it strikes me that if it's there for us to be able to discuss it at that particular point, it would make much better sense for us to have it at the beginning so that we can look at it in the whole, because otherwise I'm just not quite sure how we're going to do that in the debate itself.
There will not be a draft code of practice available at that stage, so I will speak in general terms about what we would intend to include in that, but there will not be a written document at that stage.
Okay, it would still be helpful, I think, to have something in writing, even in advance of each one that we can scrutinise, because we're kind of being asked to scrutinise something in its fullness without that level of detail. But anyway, I'll leave that there because I think it's been covered on enough. The other question I was going to just come to, though, if I may, is we've obviously heard, we know that the state pension has been explicitly excluded from the eligibility verification measures, and we've got the 3 means-tested benefits that are the initial focus. Just wondering why you've left it open to include other non-means-tested benefits in the future, and what data would you be asking for in those cases?
So the state pension is excluded because of the particular nature of the eligibility criteria for state pension, and because of the consequently incredibly small amount of fraud that we see on state pension. When you consider the number of people who we would have to bring into scope of the measure in order to go after what is a tiny amount of fraud, it's not considered proportionate, as far as I'm concerned, to do that. In terms of other benefits, the determination that we have made as to the 3 benefits that should initially be in scope is entirely predicated on current levels of fraud and error, so we want to retain the ability, if necessary, to bring other benefits into scope should there be a surge in fraud in those benefit areas. So we don't anticipate that, but we want to future-proof the bill as best we can should there be any material changes in the level of fraud in those areas. But for instance, if you think about the tiny amount in state pension versus the 1 in every £8 on universal credit that is currently spent that turns out to be fraud or error, then it's clear that it's right to distinguish between benefits and consequently have some in scope and others not.
Sally Jameson.
What happens when a flag on an account is made under the EMV measure, and is that sufficient to find that someone has committed fraud?
So I answered this slightly in response to Ms Payne, but the flag in and of itself does not mean that somebody has been found guilty of fraud. A bank indicating to us that somebody has above a certain amount of capital in their account does not mean job done, tick box, that person receives news that they have been found to have committed fraud, and then we go through the penalty process with that individual. It would be referred to the most appropriate team for investigation. So the team in the case of capital fraud that looked at that particular type of fraud. The principal other type of fraud that we think would be in scope is people who have been out of the country for longer than they are allowed to be as a condition of their benefit. And again, it's really important that we didn't automatically penalise somebody for having done that, because that could be on grounds of a health emergency abroad, or I had somebody in my advice surgery recently whose flights had been cancelled due to an environmental issue in the country that he was seeking to return from. So it's really important that actually what happens is that it's triaged to a human investigator to look into what the nature of the flag is, what the benefit eligibility criteria that we suspect may not have been satisfied is, but then to take the appropriate steps needed to establish whether or not there is a legitimate reason for that.
Simon Berry.
Just a couple of quick questions of clarification, really. Can I check with Minister Weston, are you open to a negative eventual human rights verdict on this? I know we've had questions, many people from the witnesses have said they need answers from the Code of Conduct, and we know that rights around data protection, privacy, discrimination are engaged by this. If in the end, once we've seen the details of the Code of Practice, there is a negative verdict on any of those, are you open to changing or withdrawing parts of the bill, for example, to bring reasonable suspicion to the front instead of the end of the process, for example?
I mean, we would need at that point to take advice, legal advice primarily, if there is that level of concern around human rights impact. So I wouldn't want to second guess, but certainly in the instance where those views had been put forward and the legal advice suggested that they were valid, then clearly we would need to take appropriate action to make sure that the bill was legal and satisfactory.
Okay, thank you, because a lot of people have said it's kind of contingent. That's helpful. And just one more thing about error, if that's okay. I know you earlier on said you're aiming to reduce the amount of overpayment through the processes. Will that also relate to underpayments in terms of errors? And what percentage of error in terms of innocent people being targeted for investigation by the new powers, do you think is acceptable?
So I think in terms of what I mean when I talk about reducing overpayments, I think I mean reducing the value of overpayments rather than the number of overpayments, because obviously for a bank account to be flagged, there would have to be something in there that caused that flag. So it would not reduce the overall number of overpayments necessarily, but it would reduce the amount of debt that somebody had accrued potentially were the eligibility verification measure to identify that at an earlier stage. We've seen some horrendous cases through the carers allowance issues that have come to light of really significant numbers because it has gone on for several years. That is the sort of thing that we would be able to stop as a result. And I'm really sorry, Sean, I can't remember the rest of your question.
So yeah, just to clarify, so if their financial situation got worse instead of better, and if it gets better, you withdraw the payment, you wouldn't seek to send someone in to try and increase the payment? So if they started to obviously face difficulties from the data you're collecting.
So it would not. I'm not sure I fully understood the question. So do come back in if needed. It is clearly the case that if somebody has been receiving benefits that they are not entitled to for whatever reason, then they could end up in a worse financial position as a consequence. That's necessarily the case for two principal reasons. One is, in universal credit, all overpayments are reclaimed regardless of the circumstances behind them. That was the policy enacted by the previous government. The other reason is that they may no longer receive benefits that they had previously considered themselves to be entitled to and believed that they were entitled to. So, for instance, if it comes to light that you've got £18,000 in your account and there's no mitigating circumstance for that, then it would be the case that you would be worse off in overall terms because you would no longer receive that benefit.
Neil Coyle.
I'm sorry, the second question I asked was not answered,
well,
which is what percentage of error?
On what percentage of
error do you think would be acceptable in terms of innocent people being targeted for investigation?
I mean, I wouldn't put a percentage on it. I'm not prepared to put a percentage on it. We'd have to see what came out. We have done 2 previous trials on this. We're fairly confident in the mechanisms that are in place, and that's underpinned some of the assumptions that we have made. We are committing through this process to a test and learn phase so that we can keep errors as minimal as possible. I ideally would not want to see any errors at all, but ultimately the way that we have structured this is that were something to come back that was a false positive, as it were, it would not lead to an immediate decision because it would then be passed to a human investigator for further investigation.
Sorry, Geoff.
Is that okay?
That's fine, thank you.
Neil Coyle.
Thanks, Chair. I guess the first question is sort of about legacy, because the last government was truly record-breaking in that we now have a social security system with the highest ever fraud rates, with little action to tackle it. And we heard from witness after witness today who said that the police just have lacked capacity, resource to tackle the problem. So to what extent do you see this legislation as necessary to address the challenge that's gone untackled for over a decade?
I think it's fundamental, both in terms of the lack of previous action that you identify, but also just in terms of a general modernisation of powers. The world is changing, the nature of fraud is changing, the behaviours exhibited by fraudsters are different to 10, 15 years ago. The previous government obviously tried to bring forward the third-party data measure, now likened to the eligibility verification measure. We didn't have the oversight and safeguards in place, I would argue, that we have now. But there are a number of totally new proposals within this bill that I think are crucial. I would particularly suggest, in reference to the point that you made around the capacity of the police, that the powers of search and seizure will be particularly helpful in speeding up investigations into serious and organised crime, because we can crack on with that, as it were, and enter premises without the need to wait for coordinated action from the police. But the other totally new power that I think is really important here, and I personally think it is a fairness argument, is the ability to directly deduct from people who receive their income through means other than benefits or PAYE employment. So overall, it's a fundamental change to the way that we do it. It is part of a broader package, though. This, as I said earlier, says 1.5 billion over the forecast period, but it's part of a broader suite of measures that amount to the largest ever intervention to tackle fraud of £8.6 billion over that period. Unfortunately, like many of these things, that number is so high because the level of fraud that we have is so high.
And just to add to that, the PSFA measures are entirely new, and there's previously been no powers to investigate and recover fraud from the wider public sector outside of tax and welfare. And this is some of the highest value fraud through procurement or businesses falsely applying for government grants that is currently going uninvestigated because of those resource pressures that you talked about. So I think these are landmark new powers to investigate fraud across the wider public sector that haven't been considered previously.
And we also heard from the last panel in particular, that disabled people lack confidence or trust in the Department for Work and Pensions, but it goes slightly beyond, I think, across government as a result of the treatment in the last budget. We actually see DWP facing a potential legal challenge because of the last government's treatment of disabled people, specifically from the Equality and Human Rights Commission. Is there additional work beyond the measures in here from either department to try and tackle some of that trust and confidence issues, to try and rebuild confidence in how the department treats disabled people specifically, or how government treats disabled people specifically?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're always looking at ways that we can build stronger relationships and build trust. In terms of specific interventions, I would argue that actually, although it runs contrary to the evidence that we heard from the witnesses, there is the potential, specifically through the eligibility verification measure, to build trust, not just with disabled people, but all people in receipt of benefits, because we will be able to check that what they have they are entitled to, and that capture of overpayments at an earlier stage, and that ability to know that people who are genuine claimants are receiving the right amount of benefit will help to build that trust, because I think what really erodes trust is being captured in a position where you think that you have been receiving benefits that you are entitled to for several years, and then end up with, for instance, a £35,000 debt to the department. So there is a suite of activity ongoing with stakeholders. The Minister for Social Security and Disability is doing a tremendous amount of work to reach out, to repair relationships where that needs to happen. But I also think that that work needs to continue, because it is a really fair point when people tell us that they are fearful of the DWP. When I speak to people who don't want to apply for current benefits, they want to stay on legacy benefits because they're fearful that they will lose entitlement through that application process. That's something that we need to constantly keep under review and look at what we can do to improve those relationships.
Charlie Dewhurst.
Thank you, Chair. You've mentioned a number of times forms of human engagement throughout this investigative process. Are you convinced that this programme will be sufficiently resourced? I know the previous government, for the DWP angle, had said they needed an extra 1,400 counter fraud officers and 2,000 additional to look at universal credit. So are you confident you'll be able to deliver these investigations in a timely fashion and achieve the savings you want to achieve?
It's a really, really important question, and something that I've sought to reassure myself of. But within the spending review process that we have already been through, that we did secure additional funding for further targeted case review officers and officers in the fraud space. The number of fraud staff that we have in the department, I actually think is slightly concerning, not because of the lack of, but because of the number of people that we have, because it suggests the scale of the problem. I think we have had no option, because of the spiralling nature of fraud, to significantly scale up the number of people that we have working on both prevention and detection of fraud. But I hope by embracing new technology, through data sharing and through other mechanisms, that is something that we can look to gradually reduce over time, because I think it's a pretty damning indictment of the state that we are in with fraud and error, that we have the number of people that we are. So to answer the question, I am assured, and we have got funding secured for the people that we need.
There being no further questions, I thank the ministers for their participation and indeed all the witnesses that we've had today. And I invite the whip to move the adjournment.
Thank you, Jasleen. I'd like to move that the committee do now adjourn.
The question is that further consideration of the bill be now adjourned. As many of that opinion will say aye.
Aye.
Of the contrary, no.